An introduction to the book of Genesis. Genesis was completed by Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in 1513 BCE. Born in 1593 BCE, Moses was a prophet, leader, judge, historian, and mediator. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch, as well as Job, Psalm 90, and possibly Psalm 91. The name Genesis means origin or birth. The book explains the origin of the universe and how God prepared the earth for people to live on it. The account also describes the origin of the Israelites and their growth in Egypt until the death of Joseph in 1657 BCE. Genesis has 50 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 outline how God, in 6 periods called days, prepared the earth for humans and then created the first man and woman, Adam and Eve. They were to fill the earth and subdue it, and they had the prospect of everlasting life. In chapter 3, Eve is tempted by a serpent to disobey God. Adam joins her in disobedience, bringing sin and death into the human family. In chapter 6, wicked angels materialize and take women as wives, producing hybrid offspring called Nephilim. Wickedness abounds, and God decides to put an end to all flesh by means of a great flood. Noah, however, has found favor with God, who tells him to build an ark to save his family and the various kinds of animals. In chapters 10 and 11, we read that after the flood, people start to build a city with a great tower, thus defying God's purpose for humans to fill the earth. But God confuses their language, scattering them. Chapters 11 to 25 focus on Abraham, a man of faith. In chapter 12, Jehovah tells Abraham, then called Abram, to enter the land where he would one day become a great nation, and the means by which all peoples will be blessed. In chapter 15, Jehovah tells Abram to look up and count the stars if he can. So your offspring will become, God says. Did you know? Genesis sets the theme for the entire Bible. The vindication of Jehovah's right to rule and the fulfillment of his purpose for the earth and mankind by means of his kingdom in the hands of a future offspring. This offspring and his work were first foretold at Genesis 3:15. The book of Revelation shows how that offspring crushes the original serpent, Satan, and brings the promised blessings to all obedient mankind. In chapter 19, God destroys Sodom, Gomorrah, and neighboring cities because of their gross sexual immorality. In chapter 22, Jehovah tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. But when Abraham attempts to do so, Jehovah stops him and reaffirms his earlier promises concerning Abraham's future offspring. Chapters 24 to 50 focus largely on Isaac, his twin sons Jacob and Esau, and Jacob's son Joseph. Isaac blesses Jacob, who then goes to distant Padan Aram. There, by means of Leah, Rachel, and their 2 maidservants, Jacob fathers many children, including 11 sons. Jacob then returns to Canaan, where God changes his name to Israel, and where Rachel gives birth to Jacob's 12th son. Chapters 37 to 41 tell how Jacob's 17-year-old son Joseph is sold by his brothers and becomes a slave to Potiphar, a court official of Pharaoh. Potiphar's wife later tries to seduce Joseph, but fails. She accuses him of sexual assault, and he is imprisoned. When Joseph is 30 years old and still a prisoner, he interprets Pharaoh's dreams with the help of God's Spirit. As a result, Joseph is set free and appointed Prime Minister of Egypt. In chapters 42 to 47, Joseph is reunited with his family, who settle in Egypt as alien residents. Chapter 49 contains Jacob's deathbed prophecy about his sons. Judah's family line will produce the promised offspring, that is, Shiloh, the one to whom the obedience of the peoples will belong. As you read the book of Genesis, note how it explains the root cause of mankind's suffering. See how and why the patriarchs gained God's favor and blessing. And read how Jehovah's promises to those men of faith point forward to Jesus Christ, the King of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Exodus. Exodus was written by Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in 1512 BCE, a year after the Israelites left Egypt. The book covers a period of 145 years, from Joseph's death in 1657 BCE to the construction of the tabernacle in 1512 BCE. Exodus tells us how Jehovah delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, how he organized them into a nation, and how he taught them how to worship him. Exodus has 40 chapters. In chapter 1, we learn that the Israelites have increased at an extraordinary rate, causing Pharaoh to subject them to harsh slavery. Chapters 2 to 4 relate events around Moses' birth, his adoption by Pharaoh's daughter, and his flight to the land of Midian after killing an Egyptian who was oppressing a Hebrew. Many years later, Jehovah commissions Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt. In chapters 7 through 10, Moses, using his brother Aaron as spokesman, repeatedly tells Pharaoh to send Israel away, but Pharaoh refuses to do so. Jehovah responds by bringing 10 plagues on Egypt. These include turning the Nile River into blood, covering the land with frogs, and inflicting boils on man and beast. In chapter 12, God institutes the Passover. He also brings the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn. A humiliated Pharaoh, whose son is among the dead, at last tells the Israelites to leave. In chapter 13, by means of a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, Jehovah leads his people to freedom. In chapters 14 and 15, Pharaoh foolishly pursues the Israelites, but Jehovah drowns him in the Red Sea along with his military force. Moses and the Israelites then sing a victory song to Jehovah. Did you know? Through Moses, Jehovah told Pharaoh, "For this very reason I have kept you in existence, to show you my power, and to have my name declared in all the earth." God's name did become widely known. Even 40 years later, the people of Canaan, including Rahab of Jericho, recalled the events at the Red Sea. More important, Pharaoh's humiliating end serves notice on all who defy Jehovah, including Satan. In chapter 16, Jehovah provides the Israelites with manna, which becomes their main food during their wilderness trek. In chapter 19, Moses ascends Mount Sinai, where God promises that if the Israelites strictly obey him, they will become to him a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. In chapter 20, the people witness thunder and lightning, the sound of a horn, and smoke coming from Mount Sinai, as God gives the 10 Commandments. In chapter 24, Moses reads the book of the covenant to the people. They respond, "All that Jehovah has spoken we are willing to do." Chapters 25 to 40 deal largely with the priesthood, the construction of the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the lampstand, and other sacred items. Chapters 28 and 29 focus on the attire of the priests and the installation of the priesthood. The high priest's attire includes an ephod and a turban with a golden plate. Engraved on the plate are the words, "Holiness belongs to Jehovah." In chapter 32, while Moses is on Mount Sinai, the people make a golden calf and worship it with dancing and singing. When Moses returns, he burns and crushes the idol, scatters the powder on the water, and makes the Israelites drink it. In chapter 34, Moses, again on Mount Sinai, hears Jehovah declare his name and attributes. Chapter 40 tells us that the pillar of cloud covers the completed tabernacle, which fills with God's glory. As you read the book of Exodus, note how Jehovah can humiliate the proud and arrogant. Observe how he uses the humble and meek, and see how his deliverance of Israel strengthens our faith in our future deliverance by means of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Leviticus. Leviticus was written by Moses in 1512 BCE in the wilderness of Sinai. The name Leviticus, later given to the book, comes from a Greek word meaning pertaining to the Levites. Yet the book was written not for the Levites alone, but for the entire nation of Israel. Leviticus covers a period of about 1 month, describing the events immediately following the construction of the tabernacle. Leviticus focuses on Jehovah's holiness and the holiness of his people by their obedience to his statutes. Chapters 1 to 7 set out the various laws about offerings to Jehovah. Chapters 8 and 9 cover the installation of the priesthood, the anointing of Aaron as high priest, and Aaron's first offerings to God. In chapter 10, Jehovah puts to death 2 of Aaron's sons, the priests Nadab and Abihu, for offering unauthorized fire or incense. Jehovah then issues the command that priests must not drink alcohol before entering the tent of meeting or tabernacle. Chapters 11 to 15 set out laws about cleanness and uncleanness. In regard to food, Jehovah tells the Israelites which creatures they may and may not eat. Instructions regarding the Day of Atonement are given in chapter 16. Chapters 17 to 20 contain laws on holy conduct. For example, God's people must not eat blood or engage in any form of idolatry or spiritism as the nations around them were doing. They should show consideration for the blind, the deaf, and the foreign resident, and they should treat the elderly with respect. Did you know? The arrangements mentioned in the book of Leviticus were a shadow of the good things to come, as explained in the book of Hebrews. For example, the high priest typifies Jesus Christ. The blood of the animal sacrifices foreshadows the blood of Jesus. The most holy of the tabernacle represents heaven itself, where Jesus appeared before God on our behalf. Chapters 21 and 22 set out rules for the priesthood. For example, those serving as priests must be sound in body, having no physical defects. Chapters 23 and 24 have instructions about festivals and holy days. Jehovah also provides directions regarding the lamps in the tabernacle and the ring-shaped loaves of showbread. Chapter 24 also highlights the sacredness of God's name. At Jehovah's command, a man who cursed that name is stoned to death. Chapter 25 contains laws about the Sabbath year, the Jubilee year, the restoration of property, and the treatment of the poor. Those who are sold into slavery must be treated kindly as hired workers. Chapter 26 spells out the blessings of obedience to Jehovah and the punishments for disobedience. Chapter 27 closes the book of Leviticus with laws about things vowed to Jehovah and things devoted to Him. As you read the book of Leviticus, note how we should strive to be holy in imitation of Jehovah, why we should deeply respect His holy name, and why we can have confidence that the entire earth will reflect God's holiness under the rule of His Son, the great high priest and king of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Numbers. Numbers was written by Moses. He began the writing in the wilderness of Sinai and completed it on the plains of Moab. The narrative covers a period of 38 years and 9 months, from 1512 to 1473 BCE, when Moses finished the writing. Numbers gets its name from the 2 times that Moses numbered the people, first at Mount Sinai and later on the plains of Moab. The book highlights Jehovah's ability to lead His people. It underscores the need to obey God's appointed representatives, and it illustrates the importance of strong faith. Numbers has 36 chapters. In chapters 1 to 4, Israelite males 20 years old and up, except for the Levites, are registered for the army. The Levites are set apart to assist the priests. Chapters 5 to 9 discuss marital faithfulness, quarantining, and service as a Nazirite. In chapter 10, the Israelites pull away from the wilderness of Sinai by their tribal divisions. In chapter 11, the people complain about the manna, a miraculous food provided by Jehovah. In the next chapter, Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses. For this, Miriam is temporarily struck with leprosy and quarantined for 7 days. In chapters 13 and 14, 12 Israelite chieftains, 1 from each tribe, are sent to spy out the land of Canaan. 10 spies bring back a negative report, and the people want to return to Egypt. For this gross lack of faith, the Israelites must wander in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation has died. Did you know? Joshua and Caleb were the only spies who had faith in Jehovah. So they were the only spies who would enter the Promised Land. And they did. Caleb inherited the field and settlements of Hebron. Joshua's inheritance was in the mountainous region of Ephraim, where he died at the age of 110. Chapters 15 to 17 discuss the various offerings for sins, as well as the rebellion and execution of Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and their supporters. In chapter 21, the people again complain about the manna, calling it contemptible bread. In chapters 22 to 24, Moabite king Balak hires Balaam, a greedy non-Israelite, to curse Israel. But Jehovah makes Balaam pronounce blessings. In chapter 25, many of God's people commit sexual immorality with Moabite women. This leads to idolatry and the death of 24,000 Israelites by a scourge from God. In the next chapter, Moses takes the second census. In chapter 27, the daughters of Zelophehad tell Moses that they have no brother to carry on the family inheritance. Jehovah directs that in such situations, a daughter may have that privilege. Then, God commands Moses to ascend a mountain in the region of Abiram to view the Promised Land. Because Moses is soon to die, Jehovah tells him to appoint Joshua to lead Israel into Canaan. Chapters 31 to 36 discuss the apportioning of Canaan and other matters as the Israelites prepare to cross the Jordan River. As you read the book of Numbers, note how Jehovah patiently guides his people. See why we need to obey those appointed to take the lead among us, and reflect on our need for strong faith as we approach a far greater promised land, the new world under God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy was written by Moses on the plains of Moab in 1473 BCE, just before the Israelites entered the Promised Land. The name Deuteronomy means second law, or repetition of the law. However, the book is also an explanation of the law. Deuteronomy urges the Israelites to love and obey Jehovah in the land he is about to give them. The book consists primarily of 4 discourses, a song, and a blessing by Moses. In the first discourse, found in chapters 1 to 4, Moses reviews Israel's history after the Exodus and urges the people to remember what Jehovah has done for them. For example, Moses reminds them that Jehovah eliminated the faithless and cowardly generation that, 40 years earlier, feared the inhabitants of Canaan. In the second discourse, contained in chapters 5 to 26, Moses exhorts the people to obey God's commandments, not out of mere duty, but because they love him with all their heart, soul, and strength. Did you know? In the ancient world, foreigners often had no legal rights, and widows and fatherless children faced many difficulties. In Israel, however, Jehovah's law applied to and benefited all, including foreigners, widows, and fatherless children. Jehovah loves these individuals, and his people should love them too. In chapter 7, Moses tells the Israelites that Jehovah will clear away the nations in the Promised Land, which are more populous and mightier than Israel. In chapter 8, Moses describes Israel's inheritance as a good land, with streams of water, wheat, barley, grapevines, fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. But it is a land filled with false worship. So in chapter 12, the Israelites are commanded to pull down the altars to false gods, to shatter the sacred pillars, to burn the sacred poles, and to cut down the graven images. In chapter 16, Moses reminds God's people to celebrate the Passover, as well as the 3 great festivals: the Festival of Unleavened Bread, the Festival of Weeks, and the Festival of Booths. Chapter 18 contains a prophecy about a future great prophet. Moses says, "Jehovah your God will raise up for you from among your brothers a prophet like me. You must listen to him." The third discourse in chapters 27 and 28 sets out the cursings for disobedience and the blessings for obedience. After the nation crosses the Jordan River, the cursings are to be recited on Mount Ebal, where half of the tribes are to stand. The other tribes are to stand on Mount Gerizim and bless the people. Chapters 29 and 30 contain Moses' 4th discourse, in which he makes a covenant with the people, telling them to choose life by obeying Jehovah. In chapter 31, Jehovah commissions Joshua as Moses' successor. Joshua should be courageous and strong as he leads the nation into its God-given land. Chapter 32 records the Song of Moses, which powerfully extols God's faithfulness in contrast with the Israelites' unfaithfulness. In chapter 33, we read the blessing that Moses pronounced on the Israelites before his death. In the final chapter, Moses ascends Mount Nebo, where he is shown the Promised Land. Jehovah says, "I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross over there." Moses then dies at 120 years of age, and Jehovah buries him in a secret location in Moab. As you read the book of Deuteronomy, see how Jehovah blesses those who love him. Note how he withholds his blessing from those who disobey him. And discern how the principles behind God's law are reflected in the teachings of Jesus, the prophet like Moses, who is also the king of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is named after its writer, Joshua the son of Nun, who succeeded Moses as leader of Israel. The book likely covers a period of more than 20 years, starting in 1473 BCE and ending in about 1450 BCE when the book was completed. The book of Joshua can be divided into 4 sections: Israel's entry into Canaan, the conquest of the land, the apportioning of it to the individual tribes, and Joshua's final exhortations. The book provides valuable lessons on the need for courage, faith, and obedience, especially when God's people face strong enemies. In chapters 1 and 2, Jehovah tells Joshua to be courageous and strong. The Israelites prepare to cross the Jordan River, and Joshua sends out 2 spies who go to Jericho. The spies go to the home of Rahab, a prostitute. Moved by faith in Jehovah, she hides the spies, thereby disobeying the order of the king. In chapters 3 to 6, Israel miraculously crosses the Jordan River on dry ground, even though the river is at flood stage. The Israelites observe the Passover and begin to eat the produce of the land. Joshua then meets a man with a drawn sword. The man is the prince of Jehovah's army. Through him, Jehovah tells Joshua how to conquer Jericho. Chapters 6 to 12 describe the conquest of the Promised Land. In chapter 6, Jericho falls. Only Rahab and her father's household are spared. In chapter 7, Achan is exposed for disobediently taking spoil from Jericho. He is put to death along with his family, who no doubt helped to conceal his sin. Did you know? Rahab and Achan provide contrasting lessons in faith and obedience. Though a Canaanite, Rahab was saved because she obeyed the spies and showed courageous faith in Jehovah. Although Achan was a member of God's dedicated nation and witnessed Jehovah bringing down the walls of Jericho, he was put to death because of his disobedience, lack of faith, and greed. In chapter 8, Ai is conquered and reduced to a permanent mound of ruins. Joshua then reads God's law to the people. Half of the nation stands in front of Mount Gerizim, and the other half in front of Mount Ebal. In chapter 9, the Gibeonites trick Joshua into making a covenant with them, and he spares their lives. Chapters 10 to 12 contain a record of some of Israel's God-given victories. God even hurls great hailstones at the Amorites and makes the sun stand still so that Israel can take vengeance on its enemies. In chapters 13 to 22, the Promised Land is apportioned among the tribes of Israel. The tabernacle is set up at Shiloh, and the Israelites select 6 cities of refuge for the unintentional manslayer. In chapter 22, the tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh go to their inheritance east of the Jordan. Chapters 23 and 24 contain Joshua's farewell speeches. He tells the people to fear Jehovah and serve him with integrity and faithfulness. Joshua, as well as Aaron's son Eleazar, then die. Also, the Israelites fulfill their sworn oath to bury the bones of Jacob's son Joseph in the Promised Land. As you read the book of Joshua, note how Jehovah blesses faithful and obedient ones. See how he fights for his people, and observe how he fulfills all his promises, thus strengthening our faith in our future inheritance under his glorious kingdom. An introduction to the book of Judges. The book of Judges was written by the prophet Samuel, who completed it in about 1100 BCE. Judges covers a period of some 330 years, from about 1450 to approximately 1120 BCE. The book primarily discusses the exploits of the judges, whom Jehovah used to deliver his people from oppression. In chapter 1, we read that the Israelites do not drive out all the pagan inhabitants of the land. Instead, they subject some of them to forced labor. In chapter 2, an angel warns the Israelites that because they have not listened to Jehovah, the remaining people of the land will ensnare them in false worship. In chapters 3 to 16, we see that the angel's words begin to be fulfilled after the death of Joshua and his generation. In an often repeated cycle, the Israelites take up false worship. Jehovah abandons them to their foes. The people cry out for help, and Jehovah raises up judges to deliver them. The 12 judges are Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Barak, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and Samson. Did you know? The judges described in this book were men of faith who led and delivered God's people, recognizing Jehovah as the true leader and deliverer. They were not judges in the legal sense of the word. In chapter 3, Judges Othniel and Ehud deliver the Israelites from servitude to the kings of Mesopotamia and Moab. In chapter 4, a prophetess named Deborah sends for a man of faith named Barak. She tells him that Jehovah will grant him victory over Sisera, the chief of the army of Canaanite king Jabin, who is oppressing Israel. Jehovah gives Sisera's entire army into the hands of Barak. Not so much as one man remains. Sisera himself is executed by a woman named Jael. In chapters 6 to 8, Jehovah uses Judge Gideon and just 300 men to take the lead in delivering Israel from Midianite oppression. Chapters 11 and 12 discuss the exploits of Judge Jephthah. With Jehovah's help, he subdues the Ammonites who, along with the Philistines, had oppressed Israel for 18 years. Chapters 13 to 16 describe the exploits of Judge Samson, a Nazirite to whom Jehovah gives extraordinary physical strength. Samson takes the lead in saving Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. The events in chapters 17 to 21 fit an earlier period of time. In chapter 17, a man in Ephraim named Micah, who has a house of gods, hires a young Levite named Jonathan to serve as his priest. Jonathan, however, is not of the priestly family. In chapter 18, hundreds of Danites who are on their way to conquer land for their tribe make a stop at Micah's house. They steal his gods and take Jonathan to be their priest. In chapters 19 and 20, men of the Benjaminite city of Gibeah commit sex crimes against the concubine of a Levite. The Benjaminites fail to hand over the guilty men, so the other tribes war against Benjamin, almost wiping out the tribe. As you read the book of Judges, note the harm that can come to those who leave Jehovah. Observe how merciful God is when His people repent and cry out to Him for help. And see why we can trust Jehovah, our great judge, to deliver us from all our enemies by means of His kingdom. An introduction to the book of Ruth. The prophet Samuel is believed to be the writer of this book. The book of Ruth was completed about 1090 BCE. The events related cover a period early in the time of the Judges. The book takes its name from one of its principal characters, Ruth the Moabitess. The other main characters are Naomi and Boaz. In chapter 1, a famine moves a man named Elimelech to take his family from Bethlehem to the land of Moab. In Moab, Elimelech dies. His sons Mahlon and Chilion marry the Moabite women Ruth and Orpah. Some 10 years later, both sons also die. Naomi, in deep despair, decides to return to Bethlehem. She urges her daughters-in-law to go back to their families. Orpah returns to her people. Ruth, however, sticks loyally to Naomi. When the two widows arrive at Bethlehem, the barley harvest has just begun. In chapter 2, Ruth, by chance, gleans in a field belonging to Boaz, who is related to Naomi's late husband. Recognizing Ruth's fine qualities, Boaz tells her to continue gleaning in his fields. When Ruth later tells Naomi that she had gleaned in the fields of a man named Boaz, Naomi says, "The man is related to us. He is one of our repurchasers." In chapter 3, Naomi instructs Ruth to ask Boaz to act as repurchaser. He and Ruth could then raise up offspring for Naomi in order to carry on the family line of Elimelech. Boaz is willing to perform this loving deed, but he tells Ruth that Naomi has a closer male relative who could repurchase her. In chapter 4, Boaz goes to the Bethlehem city gate where he meets with the other male relative, who is referred to as so-and-so. When the relative, in the presence of 10 city elders, learns of his obligations, he declines to help. Boaz then publicly accepts the responsibilities of repurchaser. Boaz now marries Ruth, and they have a son, whom the neighbor women name Obed. Did you know? Boaz set a fine example of obedience to Jehovah. He did all in his power to help Naomi and Ruth by applying God's law on repurchase, taking no shortcuts. The book concludes, Obed became father to Jesse, and Jesse became father to David, who became a king of Israel and an ancestor of the Messiah. As you read the book of Ruth, see how Jehovah turns tragedy into triumph. Observe how He rewards those who love and obey Him. And note how the book contributes to the history of David's family line, which produced the King of God's kingdom. An introduction to 1 Samuel. In the original Hebrew canon, 1 and 2 Samuel were one volume. The writing is attributed to the prophets Samuel, Gad, and Nathan, Samuel penning the first 24 chapters. 1 Samuel covers a period of just over 100 years, from about 1180 to 1078 BCE, roughly when the writing was completed. The book is largely about 4 leaders in Israel: High Priest Eli, the prophet Samuel, King Saul, and David. In chapter 1, a barren woman named Hannah begs Jehovah for a son, promising to devote him to God's service. God answers her prayer. When her child Samuel is weaned, she places him in the care of High Priest Eli in Shiloh. In chapter 3, Jehovah tells young Samuel to deliver a judgment message against Eli's house because he has failed to rebuke his wicked sons. In chapter 4, Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant at Israel's army camp and slay Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas. When 98-year-old Eli hears the news, he falls backward and dies. In chapters 5 through 7, the Philistines return the ark to Israel after suffering a series of heavy punishments from Jehovah. In the next chapter, the Israelites faithlessly demand a king. In chapter 9, Jehovah tells Samuel to anoint Saul of the tribe of Benjamin as leader of Israel. Chapter 11 shows that Saul starts out well, but before long he becomes disobedient. In chapter 13, he presumptuously offers up a burnt sacrifice. In chapter 15, he defeats the Amalekites, but disobediently spares King Agag and the best of the herd and the flock. To obey is better than a sacrifice, Samuel says. He then tells Saul that God has rejected him from being king. In chapter 16, Samuel anoints David, a son of Jesse, to be the next king. In the next chapter, David, with just a sling and a stone, kills the giant Goliath, a champion of the Philistines. Chapter 18 records the start of a lifelong friendship between David and Saul's son Jonathan. Seeing David's courage, Saul puts him in charge of the fighting men. David's campaigns are so successful that he receives more praise than Saul, who becomes filled with murderous envy. In chapter 19, David flees for his life, remaining a fugitive until Saul's death. Did you know? 1 Samuel has valuable lessons about faith and obedience. Eli and Saul disobeyed Jehovah and came to a tragic end. Samuel and David, however, served God faithfully from their youth, thus enjoying His blessing throughout their lives. In chapters 24 and 26, David has opportunities to kill Saul, but he refuses to harm Jehovah's anointed. In chapter 25, Samuel dies, and all Israel mourns. David, now in the wilderness of Paran, sends 10 of his young men to a wealthy sheep owner called Nabal to ask for provisions. When Nabal insolently refuses to help, David prepares to take revenge. However, Nabal's wife, Abigail, quickly goes to David with provisions and averts tragedy. In chapter 31, 1 Samuel closes with the death of Saul and 3 of his sons, who are buried under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh Gilead. As you read 1 Samuel, note how Eli and Saul brought disgrace upon themselves. See why Jehovah loved Samuel and David. And read how God built for David a lasting house, which eventually led to the Messiah, the King of God's kingdom. An introduction to 2 Samuel. In the original Hebrew canon, 1 and 2 Samuel were one volume. The prophets Gad and Nathan, who completed the writing of 1 Samuel, wrote all of 2 Samuel. The narrative covers a period of some 37 years, from 1077 to about 1040 BCE, when the writing was completed. 2 Samuel begins shortly after the death of King Saul and concludes just before the death of King David. The book is an intimate and honest account of David's life, as he sought to follow Jehovah with all his heart. In chapter 1, David receives tragic news. Saul and his son Jonathan have died in battle. Deeply grieved, David composes a dirge and calls it the bow. The rest of 2 Samuel can be divided into two sections. Chapters 2 to 4 cover David's kingship over Judah. Chapters 5 to 24 cover his rule over all Israel. In chapter 2, David goes to Hebron, where he is made king over the tribe of Judah. Meanwhile, Saul's army chief Abner makes Saul's son Ishbosheth king over the other tribes. In chapters 3 and 4, however, Abner and Ishbosheth are put to death, and in the following chapter, the people make David king over all Israel. David then captures the Jebusite stronghold of Zion and moves his capital there from Hebron. Zion becomes known also as the City of David. In chapter 6, David has the Ark of the Covenant brought to Jerusalem. In chapter 7, David tells Nathan that he would like to build a house or temple for Jehovah, but God gives this privilege to a future son of the king. However, out of love for David, Jehovah makes a covenant with him for an everlasting kingdom. Chapters 8 and 10 tell about David's victories over the Amalekites, Moabites, Philistines, and other enemies. Chapter 11 brings us to one of the darkest periods in David's life. He commits adultery with Bathsheba. She becomes pregnant, and David has her husband Uriah killed in battle. In chapter 12, Nathan, at Jehovah's direction, reproves David. He also says that calamity will befall David's house, and that Bathsheba's newborn son will die. Bathsheba, who is now David's wife, becomes pregnant again and gives birth to Solomon. In chapters 13 to 18, the foretold calamities on David's house begin. David's son Absalom conspires to usurp the throne, and David is forced to flee Jerusalem. In chapter 18, David's men defeat Absalom's, and Joab puts Absalom to death. Did you know? 2 Samuel powerfully illustrates the Bible's honesty. Even the failings of Israel's great leaders are openly exposed. We also see that truly repentant sinners, while reaping what they have sown, can be forgiven. In chapter 23, David humbly acknowledges, "The Spirit of Jehovah spoke through me. His word was on my tongue." In chapter 24, David is incited to register the nation. This bad act angers Jehovah, who brings a scourge on the people. At the prophet Gad's direction, David buys the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, builds an altar there, and offers up sacrifices to God. At Jehovah's command, the scourge against Israel is halted. As you read 2 Samuel, see how honestly God's prophets recorded Israel's history. Observe how sin can have tragic consequences. And note God's promise to give David a lasting kingdom, a promise fulfilled in Jesus Christ, the Son of David and King of God's kingdom. An introduction to 1 Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings were originally one volume, which was later made into two. Jeremiah is believed to be the writer. 1 Kings continues where 2 Samuel leaves off. The account covers a period of some 129 years, beginning about 1040 BCE with King David's final days, and ending in about 911 BCE, when King Jehoshaphat dies. In the first part of the book, after the death of King David, Israel enjoys peace and prosperity under Solomon's rule. In the second part, false worship takes root, and Israel is split into two kingdoms. In chapter 1, Solomon is anointed as king. In chapter 3, Jehovah blesses King Solomon with extraordinary wisdom, along with riches and glory. In chapter 4, God's people prosper under Solomon's rule. Chapters 5 through 8 discuss the construction of the temple, the making of its utensils, and Solomon's dedication prayer. In chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba hears a report about Solomon and then travels to Jerusalem to see him. After observing the king's wisdom and prosperity, she says, "Look, I had not been told the half." In chapter 11, Solomon, in disobedience to Jehovah, loved many foreign women. These pagan wives gradually incline Solomon's heart to worship other gods, including Ashtoreth and Milcom. After reigning for 40 years, Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam takes the throne. In chapter 12, Rehoboam promises to add to the already heavy burden on the people. 10 tribes revolt and make Jeroboam their king. Rehoboam is left with the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Jeroboam sets up the worship of golden calves to discourage his subjects from worshiping in Jerusalem. Idolatry becomes entrenched in the northern kingdom, and this leads to oppression, power struggles, and assassinations. In chapters 14 and 15, Rehoboam and Abijam after him allow false worship to take root in the southern kingdom. Did you know? About 33 years after Solomon inaugurated the temple, Jehovah allowed Pharaoh Shishak to plunder its treasures. This shows that Jehovah is pleased not by impressive buildings, but by pure worship. In chapter 15, Asa becomes king in Jerusalem, and he does what is right in God's eyes. He is succeeded by his son Jehoshaphat, who imitates his good example. The next chapter mentions a number of wicked kings in the northern kingdom. These include Ahab, who marries the pagan princess Jezebel. She and her husband bring Baal worship into the kingdom. In chapter 18, the prophet Elijah proposes a test on Mount Carmel to show who is the true God, Jehovah or Baal. Jehovah demonstrates that he is the true God. In chapter 19, Elijah flees for his life when he receives a death threat from Jezebel. Jehovah appears to Elijah at Mount Horeb and comforts him in a calm, low voice. He gives Elijah further assignments. In the final chapter, Ahab disregards the prophet Micaiah's warning against fighting Syria. As a result, Ahab is killed in battle. His son Ahaziah takes the throne in Israel. Later, Jehoshaphat also dies, and his son Jehoram becomes king in Judah. As you read 1 Kings, note how false worship leads to great suffering. See how true worship promotes peace and happiness. And take comfort that Solomon's wisdom pales in comparison to that of Jesus Christ, the incorruptible King of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Ezra. The book was written by Ezra, a priest from the family line of Aaron, Ezra was a man of faith who made a diligent study of the Scriptures, and as a priest, had the responsibility to teach God's Word to others. He was also a skilled copyist, a job that required meticulous attention to detail. This thoroughly researched account picks up right where he concluded the book of 2 Chronicles, following the Jewish captivity in Babylon. He wrote this book in about 460 BCE in Jerusalem. Did you know? The books of Ezra and Nehemiah were combined on one scroll. Later, though, the scroll was divided into the two books we have in our Bibles today. The book of Ezra contains 10 chapters. Chapters 1 through 6 describe the return of a small group of Jews to Jerusalem. In 537 BCE, they rebuilt the altar and celebrated the Festival of Booths, thus ending the 70-year desolation. In the following year, the foundation of the temple was laid. And although opposition halted the work for a time, the house of Jehovah was completed by 515 BCE. In chapters 7 to 10, we jump forward almost 50 years to 468 BCE as Ezra recounts his own perilous journey to Jerusalem. Upon arrival, Ezra was shocked to find that serious sins have taken place among the Jews. He approached Jehovah in public prayer, and action was taken to restore the spiritual condition of the people. As you read the book of Ezra, take note of how Jehovah fulfilled his promise to free his people from exile in Babylon and to restore true worship in Jerusalem. Important steps leading to the appearance of the Messiah. An introduction to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a faithful Jewish man who served in the royal Persian court of Shushan. He had the high-ranking position of cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. Sometime after 443 BCE, the book of Nehemiah was written in Jerusalem. It begins by describing events that happened about 12 years after those in Ezra's account. The book contains 13 chapters that cover events that began in 456 BCE to sometime after 443 BCE. However, the first 12 chapters focus on what took place just within the first year. The events in chapters 1 and 2 began to take place near the end of 456 BCE. Men from Jerusalem told Nehemiah about the deplorable condition of the city's walls and gates. Nehemiah prayed to God for direction. In answer to Nehemiah's prayer, the Persian king sent him to Jerusalem as governor and granted him permission to rebuild the walls. Upon arrival, Nehemiah inspected the city walls. He then gathered the people and announced his mission with the words, "Let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem." The mission to rebuild Jerusalem marked the beginning of the 70 weeks of years mentioned in Daniel's prophecy. At the end of 69 weeks of years, the Messiah would appear. Chapters 3 to 6 recount the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls and gates despite enemy opposition. Did you know? A large workforce of men and women repaired the estimated 2,600 meters of walls with its gates in just 52 days. Chapters 7 to 12 show how Nehemiah and Ezra took the lead in helping the people return to true worship. The people gathered to hear the law being read and explained. Next, the 8-day Festival of Booths was held. After this, the walls of Jerusalem were inaugurated. Nehemiah continued as governor of Jerusalem for 12 years before returning to his duties under King Artaxerxes. Chapter 13 tells us that Nehemiah traveled to Jerusalem a second time, only to find that the Jews had not kept their promises to Jehovah. He then took decisive action to correct the situation. As you read this stirring account, notice how Jehovah used a Persian king to accomplish his will. Observe how Nehemiah's zeal for and knowledge of God's law led to blessings, And note how the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls became a key to understanding an important prophecy in Daniel that pointed to the appearance of the Messiah. An introduction to the book of Esther. Esther is the second of two Bible books bearing a woman's name. The Jewish woman Esther is featured prominently in the account, which was most likely written by Mordecai, Esther's older cousin. When Esther was orphaned, Mordecai became her guardian. Esther and Mordecai became part of the court of King Ahasuerus. The royal court was in Shushan. The city of Shushan was located in the heart of the Persian Empire, which spanned from India to Ethiopia. The book of Esther records events that began in 493 BCE. It was written about 475 BCE and completed before the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were written. In Esther's day, a small remnant of Jews had already returned to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, but many others still lived throughout the Persian Empire. The book of Esther contains 10 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 record the Persian king's search throughout the empire for a new queen. Esther was finally chosen. Chapters 3 to 7 disclose how Haman, an enemy of God's people, rose to the position of prime minister and hatched a plot to annihilate the Jews. Haman used the king's signet ring to seal a decree ordering the death of all the Jews, including Mordecai. If successful, Haman's plan would have cut off the family line leading to the Messiah. Upon learning of the plot, Esther decided to follow Mordecai's advice and approach King Ahasuerus. Did you know? Appearing before the king unsummoned could have meant a death sentence. Only if the king held out his golden scepter could the offender be spared. Esther courageously approached the king and exposed the wicked plot. Upon learning of it, the king was so furious that he had Haman executed. Chapters 8 to 10 relate how Mordecai is appointed prime minister in place of Haman. Esther and Mordecai enacted a new legal decree, sealed with the king's own signet ring, that authorized the Jews to defend themselves when attacked. The decree was sent throughout the empire. Jehovah gave the Jews a great victory and preserved the family line leading to the Messiah. As you read this book, note how Mordecai and Esther skillfully used the Persian legal system to protect the Jews, how Jehovah can deliver his people out of any situation, and how young Esther courageously risked her life to protect God's people and the family line leading to the Messiah. An introduction to the book of Job. This book is grouped with 4 other poetic books, and it is among the oldest books in the Bible. It was completed by Moses about 1473 BCE, toward the end of the Israelites' 40-year trek in the wilderness. The man Job lived in Uz. Shem, a forefather of Abraham, was likely an ancestor of Job as well. Even though Job was not an Israelite, he was a worshiper of Jehovah. Job was very wealthy. He had many servants and owned thousands of sheep, camels, and other livestock. He and his wife had 10 children, and he was highly respected in his community. However, all of this was lost because of a series of tragic events. At the time Job's trials took place, Jehovah said that there was no one like Job on the earth. Therefore, we can place these events after the death of the faithful man Joseph, but before Moses became leader over Israel. The book of Job contains 42 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 reveal events that took place in the heavens. Satan challenged Jehovah, and claimed that Job would not remain faithful when faced with adversity. Chapters 3 to 31 contain several rounds of debates between Job and his three companions, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Eliphaz ridiculed Job's integrity and implied that man is useless to God. Bildad suggested that Job was suffering as punishment for his sins. Zophar harshly insinuated that Job was wicked. Job attempted to defend himself from these accusations, but in doing so, he made incorrect statements about Jehovah. In chapters 32 to 37, after listening to what Job and his companions had to say, the young man Elihu offers wise counsel. Then, in chapters 38 to 41, Jehovah, speaking out of a windstorm, corrects Job's thinking with thought-provoking questions about creation. Did you know? The book of Job describes the earth as suspended upon nothing, a fact that was not widely recognized until centuries later. In the final chapter, God commands Job's three companions to offer a sacrifice and tells them that Job will pray in their behalf. Jehovah then restored Job's health and reputation, gave him double the wealth he had before, blessed him with 7 more sons and 3 more daughters, and allowed him to live for an additional 140 years. As you read this book, pay attention to how this account proves that Jehovah is not the cause of human suffering, how events in the heavens help us to understand the issue of universal sovereignty, and how the outcome of Job's trials gives us a glimpse of future kingdom blessings for those who remain loyal to Jehovah. An introduction to the book of Psalms. Psalms is a compilation of sacred songs, which have been an important feature of true worship that highlight giving praise to Jehovah. In fact, God's name, Jehovah, and a shortened form of it, Jah, appear almost 800 times throughout the book. The writing of the book of Psalms spanned about 1,000 years. Moses is considered to be the earliest composer. The Psalms were compiled after the return of the Jews to Jerusalem from Babylonian exile, apparently by the scribe Ezra. Although Jehovah inspired such men as Solomon, the sons of Korah, the house of Asaph, and others to pen these moving expressions of faith, more than half of the Psalms are attributed to David. The different experiences in David's life provided the background for many of the Psalms. The headings or superscriptions found at the beginning of many Psalms identify the writer and give other information about the Psalm. The book is made up of 150 chapters. It is the largest book of the Bible. The Psalms were compiled into 5 separate books or volumes. Several themes are developed in these lyrical works. Consider just 3 of them. Praise to Jehovah is a recurring theme. Many Psalms praise Jehovah for his saving acts. Other Psalms praise Jehovah for his creative works, from the marvels of the human body to the earth and seas. Psalm 83 praises Jehovah as the Most High over all the earth. Another theme developed in Psalms is that Jehovah helps and comforts those who love him. Jehovah is referred to as the hearer of prayer and as a merciful Father who pardons repentant sinners. Psalm 23 describes Jehovah as a loving shepherd who guides, protects, and cares for his people. An additional theme is that Jehovah will transform the earth into a paradise by means of the Messianic kingdom. This kingdom will remove all wickedness and bring peace to the earth. Certain psalms are grouped together. For example, Psalms 113 to 118 formed the group called the Hallel Psalms. Did you know? It is likely that Jesus and his disciples sang these very psalms after the Lord's evening meal. Psalms 120 to 134 are called the Songs of the Ascents. Many believe these psalms were sung as the Israelites ascended to Jerusalem to attend the 3 great annual festivals. The last 5 psalms form a group in which each begins and ends with the words, "Praise Jah." An important feature of Psalms is that it contains numerous prophecies about the Messiah. Jesus himself said, "All the things written about me in the Psalms must be fulfilled." As you read the book of Psalms, take note of how it supports Jehovah's sovereignty, how Jehovah helps and comforts those who love him, and how Jehovah will transform the earth into a paradise by means of his messianic kingdom. An introduction to the book of Proverbs. King Solomon composed the majority of the Proverbs. Solomon became king of Israel in 1037 BCE, and Jehovah gave him extraordinary wisdom. Most of Solomon's Proverbs, or wise sayings, were written down during his reign. However, it seems that the entire collection of Proverbs was compiled into one book sometime around 717 BCE in Jerusalem, before the end of King Hezekiah's reign. The book of Proverbs provides divine guidance for virtually every aspect of daily life, from business dealings to family matters. As such, it helps prepare us for life under God's kingdom. Proverbs contains 31 chapters and may be divided into 5 sections. The first 3 sections are attributed to Solomon. Chapters 1 to 9 make up section 1, which consists of short discourses containing a father's advice to a son. The father warns the son about the bad results of acting on wrong desires, while emphasizing the good results of trusting in God's wisdom. Section 2, called the Proverbs of Solomon, and Section 3, called the Proverbs of Solomon transcribed by King Hezekiah's men, both present concise sayings designed to make the reader think. Many of these proverbs contrast the traits we should avoid with the ones we should cultivate. Many contrasts are used, such as laziness versus diligence, and selfishness versus generosity. These short parallels are instructive and easy to follow. These 2 sections contain more than 500 of Solomon's Proverbs. Did you know? The Bible tells us that King Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs and composed 1,005 songs. Chapter 30 makes up the 4th section and was written by Agur. He uses comparisons of 4 to help us reflect on godly wisdom, such as 4 things that are small, yet instinctively wise. The final chapter was composed by Lemuel. Some believe that Lemuel is another name for Solomon. This chapter contains a description of a capable wife. It points out her qualities and the positive effect she has on her family. Godly wisdom must be sought after like hidden treasure, but its value is eternal, unlike that of silver and gold. As you read Proverbs, note how it shows the benefits of trusting in God's wisdom instead of our own, how it identifies traits we should avoid and those we should cultivate, and how it teaches us to live under the rule of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes. King Solomon, who ruled over Israel from Jerusalem, wrote this book. Ecclesiastes was completed many years into Solomon's reign, but before his fall into idolatry. Ecclesiastes contains 12 chapters. In chapter 1, Solomon discusses the futility of human activity. In chapter 2, he looks for meaning in life by evaluating his many pursuits. Solomon writes that pursuing wealth and magnificent accomplishments is like chasing after the wind. Chapters 3 to 6 present observations by Solomon that help us cultivate godly wisdom. He shows that there is an appointed time for everything. He encourages hard work, and he extols the benefits of friendship. He refers to the enjoyment of food and the rejoicing over one's work as the gift of God. Chapters 7 to 11 provide a sobering discussion of life in this world. Solomon observes that life is short, and that man needs to use his time, energy, and resources in the best way possible. This will help him make a good name or reputation with God. Did you know? Solomon alluded to the Earth's water cycle centuries before scientists understood this process. In chapter 12, he encourages young ones to make wise choices before the challenges of old age arrive. Then he sums up all that he discussed with the words, "Fear the true God, and keep his commandments, for this is the whole obligation of man." As you meditate on the book of Ecclesiastes, note which pursuits are futile and which are worthwhile. How godly wisdom helps us enjoy the gift of life, and how cultivating a relationship with God leads to a truly meaningful life under the rule of God's kingdom. An introduction to the Song of Solomon, also known as Canticles. King Solomon wrote this poetic book in Jerusalem. It was composed sometime after the temple was built. Of the many songs composed by Solomon, this is considered his greatest. The main character is the Shulamite girl. Other characters included in this drama are the Shulamite's brothers, the shepherd, Solomon, the daughters of Jerusalem or ladies of Solomon's court, and the daughters of Zion or women of Jerusalem. The song is presented through a series of conversations in which the speakers are constantly changing. Although the characters speaking are not named, they can be identified by what they say or what is said to them. The Song of Solomon consists of 8 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 contain events that take place near the town of Shunem, which was also called Shulam. The Shulamite girl is brought into Solomon's camp, but she resists his advances and declares that she can love only her dear shepherd. Did you know? Shunem was the birthplace of David's nurse Abishag, and the place where the prophet Elisha often stayed with a family. Chapters 3 to 8 describe events that take place in Jerusalem. Solomon returns to his court, taking the Shulamite with him in an effort to impress her. The Shulamite tells the daughters of Jerusalem, or ladies of Solomon's court, not to arouse love in her for Solomon. The shepherd follows the Shulamite to Jerusalem and strengthens her with warm expressions of endearment. We should keep in mind the ancient Eastern setting of this song in order to appreciate the poetic expressions of endearment that may seem unusual today. The shepherd compares the Shulamite's eyes to those of a dove, her hair to a flock of goats, and her cheeks to a segment of pomegranate. Solomon approaches her again with flattering words, but she continues to reject his advances. In chapter 8, the Shulamite girl returns to her home. Having proved her exclusive devotion, she is reunited with her dear shepherd. Their unfailing love is described as the flame of Jah because Jehovah is the originator of true love. As you read this book, note the chasteness of the Shulamite girl, her loyalty to the shepherd, and how true love originates with Jehovah, whose sovereignty is based on love. An introduction to the book of Isaiah. Isaiah served as Jehovah's prophet. He wrote the book bearing his name while stationed in Jerusalem, the capital of the two-tribe kingdom of Judah. Isaiah had two sons, Shear-Jashub and Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. Their names signified events that would soon affect the kingdom of Judah. Isaiah prophesied for at least 46 years during the reigns of Judean kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. He completed the book sometime after 732 BCE. Hosea and Micah recorded their prophecies around the same time. Some of the events foretold by Isaiah were the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, which occurred in Isaiah's lifetime, the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened more than 100 years later, the fall of Babylon, about 200 years after Isaiah's day, and the appearance of the Messiah, which occurred over 700 years after the prophecy was recorded. Did you know? Isaiah's prophecy about the fall of Babylon foretold details such as how the city would fall, and even the name of its conqueror, Cyrus. The book of Isaiah contains 66 chapters. The first 6 chapters are largely warnings about the calamity that was to come upon Jerusalem and Judah for the sinful conduct of their inhabitants. In chapter 6, Isaiah responds to Jehovah's invitation to be his messenger and shows his willing spirit with the words, "Here I am, send me." Chapters 7 to 12 deal with the threat of enemy invasion from the combined forces of Syria and the northern 10-tribe kingdom of Israel. But in fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, Assyria defeated these two nations, removing the threat. Chapters 13 to 23 include pronouncements against Babylon and other nations for their cruelty to God's people. Chapters 24 to 35 contain messages of desolation and of restoration for Jehovah's people. Among their acts of unfaithfulness, the people of Judah turned to Assyria for protection instead of looking to Jehovah. The people of Israel turned to Egypt. In chapters 36 to 39, we read about thrilling events that occurred during King Hezekiah's reign. The Assyrian king Sennacherib invades Judah and threatens to destroy Jerusalem if the city does not surrender. Hezekiah prays to Jehovah for deliverance. Jehovah reassured Hezekiah that Jerusalem would be safe, and then miraculously delivered his people by sending an angel who destroyed 185,000 Assyrian warriors in just one night. Despite this deliverance, Judah's sins would eventually lead to Jerusalem's destruction and the Jews' exile in Babylon. In chapters 40 to 66, Jehovah comforts his people and promises to restore true worship to Jerusalem after they return from exile. You will notice that often Isaiah's prophecy focuses on God's kingdom, in which the Messiah rules and restores true worship forever. Isaiah foretold many details about the Messiah. For example, that he would be born of a virgin, come from the family line of David, reside in Galilee, and cure the sick. Jesus Christ and his apostles quoted Isaiah's prophecy more than any other to make clear the identification of the Messiah. Jesus even read Isaiah 61, 1 and 2 in the synagogue in Nazareth and applied the words to himself. As you read the book of Isaiah, note how Jehovah's prophetic judgments always come true, how Jehovah provides salvation for those who trust him, and how the foretold reign of the Messiah will bring everlasting peace to the earth. An introduction to the book of Jeremiah. Jehovah used the prophet Jeremiah to write one of the largest books in the Bible. In addition to being a prophetic book, the book of Jeremiah provides an account of the prophet's own experiences and personal feelings. Before Jeremiah was born, Jehovah took special interest in this boy who would be born into a priestly family. Jeremiah became a researcher and an accurate historian. He wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and Lamentations. He may have been close to 25 years old when Jehovah appointed him as a prophet in the year 647 BCE. This was less than 100 years after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. It was a time of turbulent changes as rival powers jockeyed for control of the region. Jeremiah served as a prophet for about 67 years until 580 BCE. His career as a prophet spanned the reigns of good King Josiah and wicked kings Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah. Jeremiah had been a prophet for about 40 years when in 607 BCE, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and a remnant of survivors taken captive to Babylon. Later, Jeremiah was taken to Egypt, where he continued in his assignment as Jehovah's prophet. The book of Jeremiah was completed in 580 BCE, 27 years after Jerusalem's destruction. The prophets Nahum, Habakkuk, Obadiah, and Ezekiel were also inspired to write during this time period. The prophet Daniel was another contemporary, but he did not complete his book until about 536 BCE. The book of Jeremiah contains 52 chapters. The events are not written in chronological order, but according to subject. In the opening chapter, Jehovah commissions Jeremiah as his prophet to convey both a message of judgment and a message of hope. Chapters 2 to 24 include Jehovah pronouncing judgment on the people of Jerusalem for such wicked actions as idolatry and violence. At Jehovah's direction, Jeremiah smashes an earthenware flask to illustrate that God would punish the nation for its bad conduct. Chapters 29 to 34 contain comfort for faithful Jewish exiles. Jeremiah restates Jehovah's promise to restore the Jews to Jerusalem and to fulfill his covenant with David for an everlasting kingdom that will bring about righteousness in all the earth. Did you know? The prophet Daniel discerned from the book of Jeremiah that the desolation of Jerusalem would last for 70 years and that God's people were about to be released. Many chapters recount how Jeremiah boldly proclaimed Jehovah's message in the face of fierce persecution. In chapter 36, Jeremiah dictates to his secretary Baruch the words Jehovah directed against God's people and all the nations. On hearing the message read to him, King Jehoiakim cuts up the scroll and throws it into the fire. However, Jehovah directs Jeremiah to have it written again. Chapter 38 relates how King Zedekiah hands Jeremiah over to his enemies, who throw the prophet into a muddy cistern. He is rescued later by Ebed-Melech, a faithful worshiper of Jehovah. The book of Jeremiah contains strong pronouncements of judgment against many nations, including Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Babylon. These nations were condemned for their enmity toward God's people. Among the events that Jeremiah recorded are the last days of Jerusalem, Babylon's destruction of the city, and the aftermath of the destruction. As you study the book of Jeremiah, observe how Jehovah condemned the wicked, but gave hope to the faithful. How Jeremiah faithfully stuck to his assignment despite hardship, and how Jehovah promised to establish a kingdom that will bring about righteousness in all the earth. An introduction to the Book of Lamentations. The prophet Jeremiah composed the Book of Lamentations shortly after witnessing the siege and destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon in 607 BCE. Jeremiah expresses deep sadness over the catastrophe that befell Jerusalem. The book is organized into 5 chapters, or poems. In chapter 1, the city of Jerusalem is described as a princess who is desolated by her enemies and becomes an abandoned widow and slave on account of her many sins. Chapter 2 reveals that it was Jehovah himself who brought about Jerusalem's destruction. Those who pass by its ruined walls are amazed at the complete devastation. In chapter 3, Jeremiah speaks of the desolate nation as an afflicted man who pleads with Jehovah to remember his pitiable and homeless state. However, Jeremiah shows a waiting attitude and expresses hope that Jehovah will, in his loyal love and mercy, restore the nation. Chapter 4 shifts attention to Jehovah's temple. Although it was once the glorious center of true worship, it was now devastated. Jeremiah relates the horrific conditions, deprivation, famine, and death that existed in Jerusalem during its final siege. Did you know? The first 4 chapters are acrostic poems. In each one, successive verses or groups of verses begin with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 5 is written from the perspective of Jerusalem's former inhabitants, who have lost their homes and freedom. Jeremiah likens them to orphans without a father, who humbly beg Jehovah for mercy and salvation. As you consider the 5 poems of Lamentations, notice how rebellion brings divine judgment, how repentance leads to divine mercy, and how sorrow will give way to rejoicing under the rule of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was the son of a priest and served as a prophet of Jehovah. He lived in Judah until 617 BCE, when Judean King Jehoiakim was forced to surrender to Babylon. Ezekiel was among the Jewish exiles whom King Nebuchadnezzar took to Babylon at that time. In 613 BCE, Jehovah commissioned Ezekiel to prophesy to the exiled Jews living in Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel faithfully fulfilled his assignment for at least 22 years. He completed his book in about 591 BCE. Ezekiel's prophetic work overlapped that of Obadiah and Jeremiah in Judah and of Daniel in Babylon. The sanctification of Jehovah's name is highlighted throughout the book of Ezekiel. The expression Sovereign Lord Jehovah appears 217 times. The book of Ezekiel has 48 chapters. In chapters 1 to 3, we read about the awe-inspiring visions Ezekiel sees by the river Kibar. During an intense windstorm, Ezekiel beholds 4 magnificent living creatures, or cherubs. Each one has 4 faces, that of a man, a lion, a bull, and an eagle. These faces reflect attributes that Jehovah possesses. Ezekiel is awed by a vision of the heavenly part of Jehovah's organization, which is represented by a celestial chariot directed by God's Spirit. Chapters 4 to 24 contain Jehovah's judgment against Jerusalem and her rebellious, idolatrous people. Ezekiel often communicated Jehovah's prophecies by means of symbolic actions. For example, Jehovah had Ezekiel engrave the city of Jerusalem on a brick and stage a mock siege against it. As a sign of the coming siege, he laid on his side for 430 days. In chapters 25 to 32, Jehovah turns his attention to the surrounding nations. They receive an adverse judgment because of their opposition to his people. Through Ezekiel, Jehovah foretells destruction for the city of Tyre and her king. Did you know? The prophecy against Tyre was fulfilled in 2 stages. Years after Nebuchadnezzar devastated the mainland city, Alexander the Great completed the destruction by building a causeway to the island city of Tyre, using the rubble remaining from Nebuchadnezzar's conquest. Chapters 33 to 48 contain a message of hope and of the restoration of pure worship. In chapters 40 to 48, we read of Jehovah giving Ezekiel a vision of a temple. This vision of the temple underscores Jehovah's high standards for true worship. As you study this prophetic book, take note of Jehovah's awe-inspiring qualities, Ezekiel's unswerving obedience to his instructions, and Jehovah's promise to unite all mankind in pure worship by means of the kingdom. An introduction to the book of Daniel. Daniel wrote this prophetic book in Babylon. He was taken to Babylon, likely as a young Judean prince, along with other nobles. In time, Daniel served as a government official for the Babylonians and later for the Medo-Persians. Daniel opens his book by relating events that began in 618 BCE when he was still a young man. He completed his writing in approximately 536 BCE. Obadiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah were Daniel's contemporaries. They lived during a tumultuous period of Israel's history that included the destruction of Jerusalem. Daniel witnessed the Medo-Persian conquest of Babylon and the return of a faithful remnant of God's people to Jerusalem. However, he did not join those returning to Jerusalem, likely because of his advanced age. The book of Daniel has 12 chapters. Chapters 1 to 6 record in chronological order the experiences of Daniel and those of his 3 companions. Chapters 7 to 12 contain Daniel's account of prophetic dreams and visions that he received by inspiration. Chapters 1, 3, and 6 recount the various tests of integrity that Daniel and his Hebrew companions successfully meet. As young men, they reject food and drink that would make them unclean in God's sight. Sometime after this, Daniel's 3 companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, bravely faced death in a fiery furnace for refusing to worship an image representing the Babylonian state. Years later, despite an official decree prohibiting petitions to anyone but Darius, Daniel perseveres in prayer to Jehovah, and as a result, is thrown into a lion's pit. With each test, Daniel and his companions maintain their integrity, and Jehovah protects them. Chapters 2 and 4 describe how Jehovah gives Daniel the ability to interpret 2 of King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Each of these divinely sent dreams has prophetic significance. The first dream is of an immense image made of various metals. This image represents successive world powers that have had a major influence on God's people. The prophecy ends with the destruction of these powers, and with God's kingdom as the only government ruling over mankind. Nebuchadnezzar's second dream features a tree that reaches to the heavens. It is cut down, and the stump is banded for 7 times. This symbolizes an interruption of rulership. However, the stump is allowed to remain, indicating a restoration of rulership. Chapter 5 relates that handwriting miraculously appears on the wall of the palace where Babylonian King Belshazzar holds a feast. Daniel tells Belshazzar that the handwriting warns of the conquest of Babylon by the Medes and the Persians. Babylon falls that very night. Did you know? A large portion of the book of Daniel was written in the Aramaic language. Aramaic was commonly spoken in ancient times, having the same letters in its alphabet as did Hebrew. Chapters 7 and 8 describe the visions Daniel sees of a series of beasts that picture the rise and fall of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Also, Jehovah gives his Son an everlasting kingdom that will replace all human governments. Chapter 9 relates that Daniel discerns from his study of God's written word that the Jews' release from captivity is imminent. Next, we read that while Daniel is praying, an angel appears to him and reveals details concerning the Messiah. Chapters 10 to 12 discuss the event when an angel again visits Daniel, encourages him, and gives him an additional vision of the future. A large part of the prophecy describes a conflict between two kings locked in a struggle for supremacy. The fulfillment of the prophecy would extend to the final part of the days. The angel reassures Daniel of God's approval and tells him that, although he will soon rest in death, he will stand up in the resurrection at the end of the days. As you read this book, note how much Jehovah values Daniel's faithfulness, how Jehovah maneuvers kings and kingdoms according to his purpose, and how Jehovah gives his Son an everlasting kingdom that will replace all human governments. An introduction to the book of Hosea. Hosea served as a prophet to the 10-tribe kingdom of Israel, and his prophecies were directed mainly to that nation. His contemporaries, Micah and Isaiah, served as prophets to the southern kingdom of Judah. Hosea began his service no later than 804 BCE, during the reign of King Jeroboam II. His career as a prophet continued for about 60 years until sometime after 745 BCE, when he completed the book bearing his name. Hosea prophesied amid great political turmoil. 4 kings of Israel were assassinated during this period. The book of Hosea has 14 chapters. Chapters 1 to 3 use Hosea's family life to dramatize Jehovah's dealings with Israel. Jehovah tells Hosea to marry a woman who would later commit adultery repeatedly. Hosea marries Gomer, who becomes unfaithful to him. Hosea's marriage to Gomer pictures Jehovah's marriage to Israel by means of the Mosaic Law covenant. Gomer's unfaithful conduct pictures Israel's betrayal of Jehovah by turning to the worship of false gods and forming political alliances with pagan nations. Chapter 3 contains Jehovah's instructions to Hosea to take back his unfaithful wife. This symbolizes Jehovah's willingness to show mercy to the Israelites if they repent of their idolatry and obey Jehovah. Hosea foretells that Israel will look for Jehovah and for David their king, a prophecy ultimately fulfilled with Jesus as heavenly king. Did you know? The northern 10-tribe kingdom of Israel was at times called Ephraim or Samaria. Ephraim was the dominant tribe of the kingdom, and Samaria was the kingdom's capital city. Chapters 4 to 13 contain judgments against unfaithful Ephraim. These were fulfilled when Assyria overthrew the nation and its capital city, Samaria. Chapter 14 contains a heartwarming invitation to Israel to return to Jehovah, who reassures the people of his mercy. As you study the book of Hosea, note how Jehovah requires unhypocritical worship, is merciful toward repentant wrongdoers, and is loyal to his promise of providing a heavenly king from the line of David. An introduction to the book of Joel. Joel prophesied to the two-tribe kingdom of Judah during the 9th century BCE, and he appears to have recorded his prophecies about 820 BCE, in the days of King Uzziah. Joel was a contemporary of the prophets Jonah and Amos. The book contains 3 chapters, and it warns of the approaching day of Jehovah. Chapters 1 and 2 mention a locust plague that will devastate the land, leaving famine in its wake. The locusts have teeth like those of a lion. They run like horses, scale walls like soldiers, and sound like chariots charging into battle. Although false worship flourishes in Jerusalem and Judah, Jehovah will not let the rebellious conduct of the people continue. Judah's only hope lies in repenting and turning to Jehovah. Did you know? The Apostle Paul quoted Joel when he said, "Everyone who calls on the name of Jehovah will be saved." Calling on God's name involves knowing Him, trusting Him, obeying Him, and putting Him first in our life. In chapter 3, the nations are called to account for mistreating God's people. They are to be crushed like grapes in a winepress. Then Jehovah promises future kingdom blessings, both physical and spiritual. In heaven and on earth, all will be united in pure worship. As you study the book of Joel, note how those who make themselves enemies of God fare badly. How different the outcome is for those who repent and return to Him. And how Joel's prophecy finds fulfillment in the proclamation of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Amos. Amos, the prophet who wrote the book bearing his name, describes himself as having been a herdsman and one who took care of sycamore figs. Amos came from the Judean town of Tekoa, located south of Jerusalem. Jehovah sent Amos as a prophet primarily to the northern kingdom of Israel. Amos prophesied sometime within the period from 829 to 804 BCE, during the reign of King Jeroboam II. Amos recorded his prophecy by about 804 BCE, after he returned to Judah. He was a contemporary of the prophets Jonah, Joel, and Hosea. The book of Amos has 9 chapters. Chapter 1 contains judgment messages against a number of surrounding nations. Chapter 2 records pronouncements against Moab, Judah, and the northern 10-tribe kingdom of Israel. Chapters 3 to 6 contain a message of judgment against Israel because of the nation's false religious practices and stubborn refusal to accept discipline. Israel has adopted a greedy, materialistic lifestyle. Luxury-loving wives pressure their husbands to defraud the poor and lowly. Chapters 7 and 8 present a series of impressive visions. Amos sees an unstoppable locust swarm, and then a destructive fire. Next, a plumb line illustrates how far Israel has deviated from Jehovah's requirements. Finally, a basket of summer fruit signifies that Israel's end is near. Did you know? During a meeting of the first century governing body, James, Jesus' half-brother, quoted from the book of Amos to show that Jehovah would gather kingdom heirs from both Jews and Gentiles. Chapter 9 includes Jehovah's promise to raise up the booth of David, referring to the royal line leading to the Messianic kingdom. As you read the book of Amos, note how Jehovah uses humble people to do important work. how those who put faith in material things and ignore God will not prosper, and how Jehovah foretells the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. An introduction to the book of Obadiah. Obadiah was a prophet of Jehovah. He recorded his prophecy about 607 BCE after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. Obadiah was a contemporary of Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. The book of Obadiah is the shortest book in the Hebrew Scriptures. It has just one chapter. Obadiah conveys a judgment message against the nation of Edom. During the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, the Edomites rejoice at Israel's suffering. Edomites capture fleeing Israelites. They hand them over to the Babylonians and share in taking spoil from the conquered Jews. Did you know? The Edomites were related to the Israelites. They were descendants of Jacob's twin brother Esau. He was given the name Edom, meaning red, after he sold his birthright for some red lentil stew. Obadiah prophesies that the nation of Edom will be plundered at the hands of her former allies. This prophecy begins to be fulfilled when the Babylonians conquer Edom. In time, Edom ceases to exist. In the closing verses, Jehovah promises to restore his people as a unified nation and reestablish true worship in Jerusalem. The book concludes with the statement, "The kingship will become Jehovah's," indicating that Jehovah's kingship will stand vindicated forever. As you read Obadiah, note how Jehovah is aware of the persecution his people suffer, how Jehovah gives his people hope in times of distress, and how Jehovah's lasting kingship will stand vindicated forever. An introduction to the book of Jonah. Jehovah assigned the prophet Jonah to deliver a warning to the Assyrian city of Nineveh. Jonah prophesied sometime during the reign of Israel's king Jeroboam II. Jonah wrote the book bearing his name about 844 BCE. This was about 100 years before Assyria took Israel into exile, and some 200 years before Nahum foretold the destruction of the Assyrian city of Nineveh. Jonah lived about the time of Amos, who also prophesied in the northern kingdom of Israel, and Joel, who prophesied in Judah. The book of Jonah has 4 chapters. In chapters 1 and 2, we learn of Jonah receiving an assignment from Jehovah to go to Nineveh. Overwhelmed, Jonah evades the assignment by boarding a ship headed for Tarshish. Jehovah causes a terrible storm to come up at sea. Jonah knows that he is responsible for the storm and tells the sailors to throw him overboard. When they do, the storm abates. Jehovah sends a huge fish to swallow Jonah. From inside the fish's belly, Jonah prays to Jehovah, and his prayer is heard. Jehovah then commands the fish, and it vomits Jonah out onto dry land. Did you know? Jesus foretold that he would die and be resurrected on the 3rd day. He called this the sign of Jonah the prophet, alluding to Jonah's deliverance from the huge fish. Chapter 3 describes how Jonah carries out his assignment. He preaches the message that Nineveh will soon be overthrown. To Jonah's surprise, however, the Ninevites repent, and Jehovah mercifully spares them. Chapter 4 reveals that instead of rejoicing over the repentance of the Ninevites, Jonah becomes angry. he sets up a shelter outside the city to see what will happen. Jehovah uses a bottle gourd plant and a worm to teach Jonah a valuable lesson in loyal love and mercy. As you read the book of Jonah, note how Jonah accepted correction and fulfilled his assignment, how Jehovah displayed loyal love and mercy toward the repentant Ninevites, and how Jesus used Jonah's experience to foretell his own death and resurrection, which opens the way to everlasting life under God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Micah. Micah was a prophet from the rural village of Moresheth in Judah. He foretold that devastation would come upon Israel and Judah. Micah's familiarity with rural life is seen in the kind of illustrations he used. He served as a prophet for about 60 years during the reigns of Judean kings Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, and he completed his book in Judah sometime before 717 BCE. Hosea and Isaiah also recorded their prophecies during that time. Although the destruction of Jerusalem foretold by Micah occurred many years after his death, he probably lived to see the destruction of Israel's capital, Samaria. The book of Micah has 7 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 disclose the revolt of Israel and Judah, the injustices committed, including those against women and children, Jehovah's warning that Samaria will become a heap of ruins, and God's promise that his people will return to Jerusalem and be gathered together like sheep in the pen. Chapters 3 to 5 contain Micah's denouncements of the leaders, the prophets, and the priests for their wickedness and greed. As a result, Zion will be plowed like a field and Jerusalem will become heaps of ruins. However, Micah also foretells that in the final part of the days, true worship will be elevated above all false religion, and people of all nations will stream to the mountain of the house of Jehovah. Did you know? Jehovah inspired Micah to foretell that Bethlehem Ephrathah would be the birthplace of the Messiah. This was fulfilled when Jesus was born in that town. You can find this prophecy at Micah 5:2. Chapters 6 and 7 highlight the deplorable spiritual condition of the people. As if conducting a legal case, Jehovah requires his people to exercise justice, to cherish loyalty, and to walk in modesty with him. But merchants ignore God's laws and cheat their brothers with fraudulent weights and scales. Micah also expresses his confidence that Jehovah will hear his pleas for justice and show loyal love toward his people. As you read the book of Micah, notice how Jehovah asks of us only what is reasonable and beneficial, how Micah trusts Jehovah to carry out judgment against the wicked, and how true worship will be restored to an elevated position by means of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Nahum. The prophet Nahum was likely living in Judah when he wrote the book bearing his name. Nahum's message focuses primarily on a single theme: the complete destruction of the Assyrian city of Nineveh. Nineveh, known for its violence and brutality, was referred to as the city of bloodshed. At one time, in response to the judgment message delivered by the prophet Jonah, the inhabitants of Nineveh repented of their wickedness. However, the Ninevites eventually returned to their wicked ways, and about 2 centuries after Jonah's prophecy, Jehovah used Nahum to prophesy against Nineveh again. The book of Nahum was completed sometime before 632 BCE, the year Nineveh was destroyed. Nahum was a contemporary of the prophets Zephaniah and Jeremiah. The book of Nahum contains 3 chapters. In chapter 1, Nahum proclaims Jehovah's judgment against the city of Nineveh. The entire city, with its collection of pagan gods made of wood, stone, and metal, will be completely destroyed. This is good news for the people of Judah. Free from that cruel and dangerous enemy, they can celebrate their festivals in peace. Did you know? We can trace Nineveh's origin back to the days of Nimrod, the founder of the first empire to exist after the flood. Chapters 2 and 3 describe Nineveh's destruction in greater detail. Nineveh was a heavily fortified city with high walls and a moat. But Nahum prophesies that the gates of the rivers will be opened, and the palace will be dissolved. These words were fulfilled in 632 BCE, when flooding caused damage to the city. This permitted the besieging forces of Babylon and Media to capture the city and destroy it. Jehovah's prophetic word through Nahum came true in every detail. As you read the book of Nahum, consider how Jehovah hates violence, how Jehovah always fulfills His word, and how Jehovah provides comfort for all who seek peace and salvation under His kingdom. An introduction to the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk served as a prophet in Judah. From the book's closing notation, "To the director with my stringed instruments," it has been inferred that Habakkuk may have been a temple musician. He wrote the book bearing his name about 628 BCE, some 20 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. He was a contemporary of Jeremiah, who also served in Judah. The book of Habakkuk has 3 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 present a dialogue between Habakkuk and Jehovah. The prophet expresses dismay over the violence, oppression, and injustice that are prevalent in Judah. Jehovah declares that soon the Chaldeans will be used to punish the nation of Judah. Jehovah assures Habakkuk that this divine judgment on Judah will not be late, and that the Chaldeans will also be punished later for their own acts of cruelty and wickedness. Did you know? In Habakkuk's day, Jehovah's temple was in Jerusalem, and the Davidic dynasty had ruled uninterrupted from there for over 4 centuries. Therefore, to the Jews back then, God's allowing the Chaldeans to destroy the holy city was unthinkable. Chapter 3 is a prayer of Habakkuk that is expressed in songs of mourning. Habakkuk recalls past manifestations of Jehovah's power. Although distressed by the conditions around him, the prophet expresses confidence in Jehovah. Habakkuk declares, "As for me, I will exult in Jehovah. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation." As you read Habakkuk, note how Jehovah is not indifferent to the suffering of His servants, how our confidence in Jehovah's salvation helps us endure with joy, and how Jehovah's judgments by means of His kingdom will not be late. An introduction to the book of Zephaniah. Zephaniah was a prophet of Jehovah in Judah, and he wrote the book bearing his name. He prophesied early in the reign of faithful King Josiah. He completed his book before the year 648 BCE, some years before Nahum and Habakkuk wrote their books, and over 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem in 607 BCE. The book of Zephaniah contains 3 chapters. Chapter 1 warns the people of Judah that Jehovah's day of judgment is approaching quickly. The people are focusing on material wealth, worshiping false gods, and assuming that Jehovah will not intervene in their affairs. In chapter 2, the people are urged to seek Jehovah. They should trust in God and live by His righteous standards. Did you know? Zephaniah's efforts bore fruit. Young King Josiah carried out a campaign against false worship to rid the nation of idolatry and to restore true worship at the temple. Chapter 2 conveys a message of doom against the surrounding nations of Philistia, Ammon, Moab, Ethiopia, and Assyria. In chapter 3, Jerusalem's proud inhabitants continue to disobey Jehovah despite His warning. Although Jehovah promises to remove the haughty ones, He offers hope and joy to humble, repentant ones. As you read the book of Zephaniah, note how we should guard against thinking that Jehovah's day will not arrive, how those who seek Jehovah will be saved, and how Jehovah gathers humble ones to be subjects of His kingdom. An introduction to the book of Haggai. Haggai was likely born in Babylon. In 537 BCE, he traveled with a remnant of the Jewish nation to Jerusalem, where he would later serve as a prophet. Haggai completed his book in 520 BCE. But why did Jehovah cause him to begin prophesying? In 536 BCE, the Jews laid the foundation for the new temple in Jerusalem. Sadly, the work stopped for many years because of opposition from enemies and apathy on the part of the Jews. In the year 520 BCE, Jehovah sent Haggai to rekindle the zeal of the Jews in order to resume temple construction. The temple was finally completed in 515 BCE. Did you know? In the 38 verses that make up chapters 1 and 2, Haggai uses the name Jehovah 35 times, 14 times in the expression Jehovah of Armies. The book of Haggai has 2 chapters that convey 4 inspired messages. Chapter 1 directs the first message toward those who are focusing on their own interests while Jehovah's house lies in ruins. Governor Zerubbabel, High Priest Joshua, and the rest of the people respond favorably and go to work on the temple just 23 days after Haggai started to prophesy. In chapter 2, Haggai delivers the second inspired message. Jehovah promises that He will shake the nations and cause their precious things to come in, and that He will fill His house with glory. Later, Haggai delivers the third inspired message to the priests, explaining that neglect of pure worship has made the nation unclean before God. Then Haggai proclaims the fourth message. Again, Jehovah speaks of shaking the heavens and the earth, but this time it will mean the complete annihilation of human kingdoms. Centuries afterward, the Apostle Paul quoted Haggai's words to show that God's kingdom in the hands of Jesus Christ will never be shaken. As you read Haggai, note how personal interests must take a backseat to spiritual interests, how mere formalistic worship does not please Jehovah, and how God's kingdom in the hands of Jesus Christ will never be shaken. An introduction to the book of Zechariah. Zechariah began to prophesy in Jerusalem around 520 BCE, 17 years after the return from Babylonian exile. He prophesied for at least 2 years, completing the book bearing his name around 518 BCE. His work overlapped that of the prophet Haggai. The rebuilding of Jehovah's temple was at a standstill. It appeared to observers that Jehovah had forsaken the city. The people there were discouraged and focused on personal comforts. Jehovah sent Zechariah to join the prophet Haggai in encouraging the Jews to resume the temple construction despite all obstacles. Did you know? Solomon's temple was completed in just over 7 years. In contrast, when Zechariah wrote his book, the reconstruction had been underway for about 20 years, but without completion. The book of Zechariah contains 14 chapters. Chapters 1 to 6 set forth a series of intriguing visions that ensured divine backing of the work of rebuilding the temple and the return to pure worship. For example, one vision features a woman named Wickedness, who is put into a container and taken far away by 2 winged women. This illustrates that wickedness has no place among Jehovah's people. Chapters 7 and 8 urge God's people to turn from unjust treatment of the poor and to deal with one another in loyal love and mercy. Chapter 10 foretells Jehovah's turning his favorable attention to his repentant people. Zechariah also recorded several significant prophecies about the Christ. He indicated that the future king of God's kingdom would triumphantly enter Jerusalem on a donkey. Zechariah foretold God's true shepherd would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Zechariah also foretold details about this messianic shepherd's death. Chapter 14 states that Jehovah forms a very great valley. This valley is for the protection of his people and results in a complete triumph of true worship. As you study the book of Zechariah, notice how Jehovah makes his work succeed despite adversity, how he describes the future king of his kingdom, and how his loyal subjects will remain safe in his valley of protection. An introduction to the book of Malachi. The prophet Malachi wrote this book in Jerusalem after the Jews returned from Babylon. He proved to be a fearless spokesman for Jehovah. Malachi completed writing his prophecy sometime after 443 BCE, many years after Haggai and Zechariah wrote their books, but about the same time Nehemiah wrote his book. About a century had passed since the first Jewish exiles returned to Jerusalem. The temple had been rebuilt, and the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls was completed, but the nation still needed spiritual guidance. The book of Malachi has 4 chapters. In chapters 1 and 2, Jehovah denounces the priests for their corrupt practices. Jehovah calls them to account because they are offering him inferior animals for sacrifice. The priests have been negligent in teaching the people, who are unjustly divorcing their wives and marrying new wives from pagan nations, something that Jehovah hates. Chapter 3 indicates there would be a forerunner to the Messiah. The Messiah, or messenger of the covenant, will come to the temple to cleanse it. Jesus did this when he threw greedy merchants out of the temple. Did you know? Malachi mentions Elijah the prophet. However, Elijah had been long dead by the time Malachi wrote his prophecy. Jesus identified John the Baptizer as the Elijah that Malachi foresaw. In chapter 4, Malachi makes a prophetic reference to the Son of Righteousness, which highlights Jesus' role as mankind's Savior. As you read the book of Malachi, notice how Jehovah expects us to give Him our best, how Jehovah hates unjust divorce, and how the messenger of the covenant, the foretold King of God's kingdom, supports true worship. An introduction to the book of Mark. Mark may have become a follower of Jesus when he was a young man living with his mother in Jerusalem. In fact, it seems that their home was used as a meeting place by the early Christian congregation. While Mark may have had limited contact with Jesus, he enjoyed association with the apostles Peter and Paul, as well as Mark's cousin Barnabas. He had the privilege to assist Paul and Barnabas in the missionary work. His ministry also took him to such distant places as Babylon and Rome. Perhaps between the years 60 and 65 CE, while in Rome, Mark wrote an account of Jesus' life. This became the third gospel to be circulated among the early Christian congregations. Although most of Mark's information is also contained in the other Gospels, he does include some unique details. For example, it is evident that this book was written with a non-Jewish audience in mind, especially the Romans. Mark explains Jewish expressions and customs that would have been unfamiliar to Romans and other non-Jews. He may have obtained much of his information from Peter, who was an eyewitness of practically all that Mark recorded. Peter's eyewitness testimony may be seen in Mark's vivid descriptions of Jesus' activity and feelings. The book contains 16 chapters and is the shortest of the four Gospels. It covers the time period from 29 to 33 CE. Chapters 1 to 10 begin with John the Baptizer's ministry and Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River. Then Mark describes Jesus' exciting 3.5-year ministry. These chapters recount Jesus' selection of his apostles, many of his miracles, and examples of his tender care and concern for people. Chapters 11 to 15 outline Jesus' final week of activity leading up to his arrest and execution. Did you know? Mark was likely the young man who ran away, leaving his garment behind on the night Jesus was arrested. Finally, chapter 16 shows that 3 faithful women are the first to discover that Jesus has been resurrected. As you read this gospel, note how Jesus demonstrated his power over sickness, death, and the forces of nature, how he showed his tender care and concern for people, and how he zealously carried out his Father's will, providing a glimpse of his future rulership as King of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Luke. Luke was a physician. Like the gospel writer Mark, Luke was not one of Jesus' 12 apostles. Also, Luke did not refer to himself as an eyewitness of the events in Jesus' life. He became a disciple probably sometime after Jesus' death. In time, he traveled with the Apostle Paul. Luke's Gospel covers the time period from 3 BCE to 33 CE. He wrote in logical order, often chronologically. Nearly 60% of the material in this book is unique in comparison with the other Gospels. For example, at least 6 of Jesus' miracles are found exclusively in Luke's account. Luke uses more than 300 terms that were either used in medicine or to which he gives a medical meaning. Only Luke speaks of a man full of leprosy and of Peter's mother-in-law having a high fever. Luke likely wrote his gospel in Caesarea while Paul was imprisoned there, from about 56 to 58 CE. So although appearing after Mark in the Bible, Luke was the second of the 4 Gospels to be written. In addition to having access to Matthew's Gospel, Luke was no doubt moved by God's Spirit to interview reliable eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry and to examine trustworthy historical documents. Luke contains 24 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 provide information about the early years of John the Baptist and Jesus. As foretold by an angel, Elizabeth gives birth to John. Mary gives birth to Jesus about 6 months later. Did you know? Luke is the only gospel writer who included an account of Jesus as a 12-year-old boy. Luke may have obtained this family history from Jesus' mother, Mary. Chapter 3 provides material that aids in determining when John the Baptist and Jesus began their ministries. Noteworthy, too, is the record of Jesus' genealogy, tracing Mary's family through King David and all the way back to Adam, son of God. Chapters 4 to 9 relate the preaching and healing work of Jesus' early ministry, primarily in the region of Galilee. Luke conveys not only specific details regarding the sicknesses that Jesus healed, but also conveys the compassion with which Jesus cured people. Chapter 6 describes how Jesus, after a whole night in prayer, chooses his 12 apostles. In chapter 9, Jesus sends out the 12 to preach the kingdom message and to heal the sick. Chapter 10 to the middle of chapter 19 describes events that mostly take place in Judea and Perea. Jesus increases the number of kingdom proclaimers by sending out 70 more disciples to preach the message. Jesus' parables of the neighborly Samaritan and the lost son, also known as the prodigal son, are mentioned only in Luke's Gospel. The latter part of chapter 19 to the end of chapter 23 records Jesus' final public ministry in and around Jerusalem and events surrounding his death. Chapter 21 includes Jesus' prophecy pertaining to the destruction of Jerusalem and to the last days of this system of things. Luke adds pestilences as a feature of the last days, a detail not mentioned in the accounts of Matthew or Mark. The final chapter records events relating to Jesus' resurrection. Luke is the only gospel writer who describes Jesus' ascension to heaven. As you read the Gospel of Luke, note how Jesus zealously shared the kingdom message and trained others to do so, how he described the conditions that would mark the last days, and how his healing people of their afflictions shows what he will accomplish as King of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of John. When he was a much younger man, John and his brother James were mending their fishing nets alongside the Sea of Galilee when Jesus invited them to be his followers. After the Passover of 31 CE, Jesus chose John as one of his 12 apostles. John was among Jesus' closest companions, and the disciple to whom he entrusted the care of his mother, Mary. The Gospel of John is the last of the 4 Gospels. It was written about 98 CE in or around Ephesus, nearly 65 years after Jesus' death. During those decades, Jesus' prophecy concerning the destruction of Jerusalem was fulfilled. It is said that 92% of this book contains material not covered in the other Gospels. John writes about love more than any other Gospel writer. The book of John contains 21 chapters. Chapter 1 reveals Jesus' role in the heavens before coming to earth. He is described as the one through whom Jehovah created all other things. Jesus is called the Word, highlighting his assignment as Jehovah's spokesman. Chapters 2 to 6 cover about 2 years of Jesus' ministry. Chapter 2 describes Jesus' first miracle at a wedding feast in Cana. When the wine ran out, he miraculously turned some 380 liters or 100 gallons of water into fine wine. Seeing this miracle strengthened the faith of Jesus' disciples. Chapter 6 reports how Jesus miraculously fed a crowd of about 5,000 men along with women and children. Chapters 7 to 12 cover the events following the Passover of 32 CE. Jesus travels to Bethany and resurrects his friend Lazarus. Although Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, he comes back to life at Jesus' command. Chapter 12 contains a description of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. A large crowd greets him with the words, "Save, we pray you! Blessed is the one who comes in Jehovah's name, the King of Israel." Chapters 13 to 19 relate the events of just one day, Nisan 14, 33 CE. Jesus celebrates the Passover with his apostles in an upper room in Jerusalem. Did you know? We can find evidence in the book of John that supports the fact that Jesus celebrated 4 Passovers during his ministry. This provides one of the lines of evidence that his ministry was 3.5 years long. Showing great humility at the final Passover, Jesus performs the duty of a servant, washing the feet of his apostles. Later that evening, Jesus says, "I am giving you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you." The commandment was new because it required that Christ's disciples show love to a greater degree. Chapter 17 contains Jesus' last prayer in the presence of his disciples. Later in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus fearlessly identifies himself to the soldiers who come to arrest him. Shortly thereafter, Jesus suffers death for all mankind. Chapters 20 and 21 relate how the resurrected Jesus appears to his disciples on various occasions. As you read the Gospel of John, note Jesus' love for mankind, his example of humility, and his identity as the Messiah, the King of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Acts. The Gospel writer Luke wrote Acts of Apostles. Chapters 1 to 12 of Acts primarily cover the activity of the Apostle Peter. Chapters 13 to 28 feature the activity of the Apostle Paul. Because Luke accompanied Paul on some of his travels, Luke was an eyewitness to certain events he recorded. The book of Acts contains a detailed history of the beginnings of the Christian congregation and its rapid growth. The account commences about where Luke's gospel account ends. Acts covers a period of approximately 28 years, from Jesus' ascension to heaven in 33 CE to about 61 CE, while Paul is still under house arrest in Rome, awaiting the outcome of his appeal to Caesar. The Gospel of Luke and Acts of Apostles were written just a few years apart, and were both addressed to the same individual, Theophilus. Did you know? When Luke wrote his Gospel account, he addressed Theophilus with the title Most Excellent, possibly indicating that Theophilus had been a prominent official. However, Luke does not use that title in Acts, which could suggest that he was writing to Theophilus as a mature Christian. Acts of Apostles contains 28 chapters. In chapter 1, Jesus tells his disciples that they will be witnesses of him to the most distant part of the earth. He then ascends to heaven. Chapter 2 records that 10 days later, on Pentecost 33 CE, Holy Spirit is poured out on about 120 disciples. Later that day, about 3,000 people are baptized. Chapters 3 to 9 relate early examples of how the disciples zealously preach and perform miraculous signs. Although they face strong opposition, they boldly continue to spread the Christian message. Stephen, an early Christian, is even murdered because of his faith. A man named Saul witnesses and approves of the execution of Stephen. However, not long after that, Jesus appears to Saul on the road to Damascus. Subsequently, Saul becomes a Christian and is later known as the Apostle Paul. Chapters 10 and 11 describe a period of peace enjoyed by the disciples. Jehovah uses the Apostle Peter to expand the preaching work to include Gentiles, or non-Jews. During this time of expansion, the term Christians is coined to identify Christ's disciples. In chapter 12, persecution breaks out again. Herod puts the Apostle James to death and imprisons Peter, who is later released by an angel. Chapters 13 to 21 describe Paul's 3 eventful missionary tours from about 47 to 56 CE. Paul travels to Cyprus and parts of Asia Minor during his first missionary tour. His second missionary tour takes him back to Asia Minor as well as to Macedonia and Greece. Paul's third missionary tour covers some 4 years and ends in Jerusalem. Paul writes 6 inspired letters during the period that includes his second and third tours. According to one estimate, the book of Acts records Paul traveling nearly 10,000 miles. In chapter 21, Paul is wrongfully arrested in Jerusalem. Chapters 22 to 26 relate Paul's defense. He appears before Felix, governor of Judea, his successor Festus, and King Herod Agrippa II. In the course of his defense, Paul appeals to Caesar, the highest Roman authority of the time. Chapters 27 and 28 describe Paul's arduous journey to Rome, which includes a shipwreck. Acts concludes with Paul under house arrest, awaiting trial in Rome. Despite confinement, he remains busy preaching to all those who come to him. As you read Acts of Apostles, note how the disciples were empowered by Holy Spirit, how they witnessed fearlessly despite fierce persecution, and how they used legal means to defend their right to preach the good news of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Romans. Romans is placed first in the listing of 21 letters in the Christian Greek scriptures. The Apostle Paul wrote 14 of these letters, including Romans. Likely in 52 CE, Paul embarked on his third missionary tour. While in Corinth in about 56 CE, Paul wrote to the Christians in Rome, a city that he had not yet visited. The letter to the Romans contains 16 chapters. In chapter 1, Paul expresses his desire to visit the Christians living in Rome in order to enjoy an interchange of encouragement. He also explains that the world's ungodly conduct is inexcusable because God's invisible qualities are clearly seen in his creative works. Did you know? Paul used Tertius as his secretary to write this letter. The faithful sister Phoebe may have delivered this letter to Rome, or may have accompanied the person who did. In chapter 2, Paul highlights God's impartiality. Both Jews and Gentiles will be judged by the same standard. In chapters 3 and 4, Paul explains that Jehovah declares Jews as well as Greeks righteous by faith, and he uses the example of Abraham to illustrate the point. Abraham lived before the law was given to Moses, and before Jesus sacrificed his life. Nevertheless, God counted Abraham as righteous because of his outstanding faith. In chapters 5 and 6, Paul reasons that Adam sinned against God, and as a result, all humans have inherited sin and death. Relief is possible only through faith in Jesus and his sacrificial death. In chapters 7 and 8, Paul discusses how the Mosaic Law revealed what sin is, and why Christians are not under that law. In chapters 9 and 10, Paul explains that those who exercise faith, regardless of their nationality, can become God's spiritual children. In chapter 11, Paul uses the illustration of a cultivated olive tree. Jews who rejected the Messiah are compared to branches that are broken off. Branches from a wild olive tree, representing Gentile Christians, are grafted in their place. In order to be part of the tree, all must remain humble and exercise faith in Jesus. In chapters 12 and 13, Paul exhorts Christians to be peaceable with all, to love one another, and to respect governmental authorities. In chapters 14 and 15, Christians are counseled to stop judging one another, but rather to support those who are weak. In chapter 16, Paul concludes with words of encouragement and warm personal greetings, mentioning 26 individuals by name. As you read the inspired letter to the Romans, note how God is impartial in his dealings with all people, how Christians should be peaceable with others, and how freedom from sin and death comes only by exercising faith in Jesus, the King of God's kingdom. An introduction to 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter to the Christians living in the busy cosmopolitan city of Corinth. Paul stayed in Corinth during his second missionary journey and helped establish a congregation there. During his third missionary journey, evidently while in Ephesus, Paul received a letter as well as disturbing reports about the congregation in Corinth. It was about 55 CE when Paul wrote to the Corinthians to address these matters. 1 Corinthians contains 16 chapters. In chapters 1 to 4, Paul corrects the Corinthians' divisive thinking and exhorts them to be united. Paul reasons that it is unimportant who plants or who waters, because God makes things grow. In chapters 5 and 6, Paul addresses the serious matter of sexual immorality. There is an unrepentant wrongdoer among them. This man must be removed to protect the congregation. The congregation is urged to flee from sexual immorality. Chapter 7 provides balanced counsel regarding both singleness and marriage. In chapters 8 to 10, we learn that sometimes we should lovingly refrain from doing what we may have a right to do, so that we do not stumble others or hinder people from accepting the good news. Did you know? The Isthmian Games were held every 2 years near Corinth. Drawing on this familiar situation, Paul used the illustration of running a race to help the congregation in Corinth to understand the need for faithfulness and endurance. In chapter 11, Paul gives direction concerning the Lord's evening meal. In chapter 12, Paul likens the congregation to the human body to show that each member is important. Jehovah is pleased when we cooperate with one another unitedly. Chapter 13 describes how love acts and how it does not act. Chapter 14 explains that congregation meetings should be orderly and harmonious. In chapter 15, we find confirmation that the resurrection hope is certain. Paul refers to fulfilled prophecy as well as eyewitness accounts of Jesus' resurrection. He explains that victory over sin and death comes through the ransom sacrifice of Jesus Christ. In chapter 16, Paul gives direction regarding the collection for the impoverished Christians in Jerusalem. As you read 1 Corinthians, note how true Christians should remain united, how the congregation should uphold Jehovah's moral standards, and how belief in the resurrection of Jesus is fundamental to our receiving kingdom blessings. An introduction to 2 Corinthians. Paul wrote his second inspired letter to the Corinthians some months after the congregation received his first. Titus had been sent to Corinth to assist in the collection for the brothers in Judea, and possibly also to observe the Corinthians' reaction to Paul's first inspired letter to them. When Titus left Corinth, he traveled to meet Paul. Because Titus brought a good report, Paul rejoiced and wrote to the Corinthians yet again. 2 Corinthians has 13 chapters. In chapter 1, Paul refers to Jehovah as the Father of tender mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our trials. In chapter 2, Paul reassures the congregation of his love for them, mindful of the strong counsel he gave them in his first inspired letter. The wrongdoer who had been expelled from the congregation has now changed his ways and should be forgiven and welcomed back. In chapter 3, Paul writes that being adequately qualified as ministers comes from God. Chapter 4 describes the ministry of the new covenant as a treasure in earthen vessels. Although we are simply imperfect earthen vessels, the message we preach can bring everlasting life to us and to those who listen to us. In chapter 5, Paul states, "The love the Christ has compels us." We cannot accept the extraordinary love of Christ without feeling compelled to live for Him. His love motivates us to imitate His example. Chapter 6 explains that fellowship between one who is a true Christian and one who is not would be an uneven yoke. It could result only in harm to the Christian's faith. Chapter 7 contrasts godly sadness with the sadness of the world. Godly sadness results when a person sees wrongdoing as a sin against God. This moves the person to seek forgiveness and turn from his wrong course. The sadness of the world is different. In this case, although a person may be sad that his wrongdoing was exposed, he has no desire to gain God's forgiveness. In chapters 8 and 9, Paul encourages the Corinthians to follow through with the relief ministry to help the brothers experiencing adversity in Judea. Did you know? Paul used forms of the same Greek word for ministry to describe the preaching and teaching work, as well as the work of providing relief. Thus, relief work is part of a Christian sacred service to Jehovah. Because of the bad influence of false apostles, arguments are set forth in chapters 10 to 13 to counteract their teaching. Paul reminds the congregation that scriptural truth can overturn strongly entrenched doctrines, practices, and attitudes that reflect imperfect human wisdom. As you read 2 Corinthians, note how Jehovah, the God of all comfort, strengthens and sustains His servants, how genuine repentance leads to friendship with God, and how even fragile humans can proclaim the good news of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Galatians. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter during or after his second missionary tour, either from Corinth or from Syrian Antioch. Although he usually used a secretary to write his letters, Paul himself wrote the letter to the Galatians. Galatians was written about 50 to 52 CE. Did you know? Galatia was the Roman province that occupied the central portion of what is now known as Asia Minor. The Galatian congregations to whom Paul wrote may have included the ones in Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Paul used this letter to counteract the work of false teachers who were asserting that observance of the Mosaic Law was an essential part of true Christianity. The letter to the Galatians has 6 chapters. In chapter 1, Paul relates his own experience of conversion from Judaism to Christianity. He reminds the Galatians that what he has taught them came through a revelation by Jesus Christ, and that they should not deviate from it. In chapters 2 and 3, Paul reasons that works of law cannot make one righteous. He calls the law a guardian that led people to the Christ. It is faith in Jesus that makes one righteous. Paul identifies Abraham's spiritual offspring as Christ and those who are heirs with Christ. The Galatians, though, are in danger of becoming enslaved to the teachings of men, Paul warns in chapters 4 to 6. In chapter 4, Paul introduces a symbolic drama using the example of Hagar and Sarah and their children, Ishmael and Isaac. Hagar and Ishmael correspond with enslaved earthly Jerusalem and her children or citizens. Sarah and Isaac correspond with the Jerusalem above, the heavenly part of Jehovah's organization, and her children, the Spirit-anointed and free sons of God. That freedom, however, should not be used as an excuse to pursue a sinful course, Paul cautions. He contrasts the works of the flesh with the fruitage of God's Spirit, and he teaches that we reap what we sow. As you read the letter to the Galatians, note how Christians can be declared righteous only by means of faith, how those who display the fruitage of God's Spirit reap benefits, and how Abraham's spiritual offspring are identified as Christ Jesus and the joint heirs of his everlasting kingdom. An introduction to the book of Ephesians. The Apostle Paul first came to the port city of Ephesus on his second missionary tour, probably in 52 CE, accompanied by Aquila and Priscilla. After a short visit, Paul departed, leaving Aquila and Priscilla behind to continue preaching and teaching. But on his third missionary tour, Paul stayed for about 3 years, zealously carrying out his ministry and forming a close bond with the Ephesian brothers. Later, about 60 or 61 CE, the Apostle Paul wrote the letter to the Ephesian congregation. He wrote it from Rome, where he was under guard awaiting trial. The letter to the Ephesians has 6 chapters. Chapter 1 highlights that God purposed an administration, or a way of managing his household. By this means, those chosen to live in heaven and those who would live on earth would be united with Jehovah through Christ. In chapter 2, the apostle likens the Mosaic law to a wall that had long separated Jews and Gentiles. The sacrificial death of Jesus abolished the law covenant and thus destroyed the wall in between the two groups. In chapter 3, Paul mentions the sacred secret of the Christ and explains that it is God's will to include non-Jews among the relatively small number of humans who are called to reign with Christ in heaven. Did you know? The city of Ephesus was famous for a huge temple dedicated to the goddess Artemis. As related in Acts chapter 19, silversmiths of Ephesus had a lucrative business selling small silver shrines of Artemis. During his roughly 3-year stay in Ephesus, Paul had exposed as wrong the use of images in worship. As a result, a number of people in Ephesus abandoned their idolatry and became believers. Because of that, those making and selling such idols became infuriated and caused a riot. In chapter 4, the Ephesians are counseled to put away the old personality, according to their former conduct, and to put on the new personality, in harmony with Jehovah's will. In chapter 5, Paul encourages the Ephesians to go on walking in love. That love should be reflected in the family. Wives are counseled to be in subjection to their husbands. Husbands are counseled to continue loving their wives, just as the Christ also loved the congregation. In chapter 6, Paul uses an illustration about armor and urges the Ephesians to put on the complete suit of spiritual armor. Doing so will help them to remain faithful despite all difficulties. As you read the inspired letter to the Ephesians, note how we must put on the new personality according to Jehovah's will, how we should put on the complete suit of spiritual armor, and how Jehovah purposed to unite Jews and non-Jews as heirs with Christ in the kingdom. An introduction to the book of Philippians. The Apostle Paul wrote this inspired letter from Rome, where he was under house arrest. He wrote the letter about 60 or 61 CE. Some years earlier, during his second missionary tour, Paul had received a vision while he was in Troas. A Macedonian man entreated him, "Step over into Macedonia and help us." So in about 50 CE, Paul and his companions began to preach the good news in the Macedonian city of Philippi. Paul established a congregation there, but not without opposition. He and Silas were beaten with rods and thrown into prison, where their feet were fastened in stocks. Paul returned to Philippi during his third missionary tour. His letter to the congregation reveals the special bond of love that he and the Philippian brothers had for each other. The letter to the Philippians has 4 chapters. In chapter 1, Paul writes that his current imprisonment in Rome has led to the advancement of the good news. The apostle's courage in the face of opposition has strengthened the brothers to keep speaking the word of God fearlessly. In chapter 2, Paul encourages the Philippians to keep imitating the mental attitude of Christ. The Philippians are then commended for shining as illuminators in the world. Did you know? Sometime earlier, the Philippians had sent Epaphroditus to Rome with a gift for Paul. Paul later sent Epaphroditus back to Philippi, entrusting him with his inspired letter to the congregation. In chapter 3, Paul warns against those who have confidence in the flesh, evidently because of their Jewish background. Paul considers any advantages that he once enjoyed as a Pharisee to be refuse compared with the privilege of knowing Christ and being in union with Him. In chapter 4, the Philippians are reminded not to be anxious over anything, but to find the peace of God through prayer, supplication, and thanksgiving. Paul also thanks the congregation for its generosity in providing for his material needs. As you read the letter to the Philippians, note how our being steadfast under trial can encourage others to stand firm. How God's Word and Spirit can help us to keep imitating the mental attitude of Christ. And how true peace comes to those who turn to God in heartfelt prayer as they await His kingdom rule. An introduction to the book of Colossians. The Apostle Paul wrote this inspired letter in Rome around 60 or 61 CE. This was during his first imprisonment there while he was under house arrest. Paul's letter to the Colossians indicates that he had not visited Colossae. Evidently, the congregation there was the fruitage of the work of Epaphras. Still, Paul knew several members of the congregation, including Apphia, Archippus, and Philemon, to whom he also wrote an inspired letter. Sometime after the congregation was founded, false teachers tried to mislead the Colossian Christians with deceptive philosophies. Epaphras traveled many hundreds of miles from Colossae to Rome to give a report on the congregation to Paul. The letter to the Colossians has 4 chapters. In chapter 1, Paul expresses his desire that the Colossians continue to grow in accurate knowledge of God. Paul then describes God's Son as the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and the one through whom all other things were created. Christ is also the head of the congregation. In chapter 2, the apostle warns the Colossians about those who are promoting philosophies and the observance of the Mosaic Law. Paul stresses that the Mosaic Law has been erased and taken out of the way. God had figuratively nailed it to Christ's torture stake. Did you know? At Colossians 4:10, Paul mentions Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. For a short time, Mark, also called John, accompanied Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary tour. But Mark left them and may have returned home to Jerusalem, which disappointed Paul. About 12 years later, however, Mark was in Rome as Paul's co-worker. Clearly, any breach between the two had been healed. In chapter 3, Paul encourages the congregation to go on seeking the things above, where the Christ is seated at the right hand of God. The apostle also exhorts the Colossians to strip off the old personality, to clothe themselves with the new personality, and to continue forgiving one another freely. In chapter 4, Paul tells the Colossians to persevere in prayer along with thanksgiving. He also writes, "Let your words always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should answer each person." As you read the inspired letter to the Colossians, note how we should continue to grow in accurate knowledge of God, how we can cultivate a Christ-like personality, and how our speech should always be gracious, especially as we proclaim the good news of God's kingdom. An introduction to 1 Thessalonians. The Apostle Paul wrote this inspired letter in Corinth, likely late in the year 50 CE, during his second missionary tour. Sometime after arriving in Thessalonica, Paul preached in the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths. Soon a congregation was established there. Opposers from among the Jews became jealous of Paul's success and incited a violent mob. The congregation continued preaching, even after sending Paul and Silas to Berea. 1 Thessalonians has 5 chapters. In chapter 1, Paul warmly commends the congregation for the way they accepted God's word and endured under tribulation. He informs them that their example of perseverance has become known to the congregations in Macedonia and Achaia. In chapter 2, Paul reminds the Thessalonians of his tender affection for them and how he worked hard to avoid being an expensive burden on them. Did you know? The Apostle Paul was a tent maker by trade. He may have done this work to cover his expenses in Thessalonica. In chapter 3, Paul writes that he had sent Timothy to Thessalonica to build up their faith. Now Timothy has returned to Paul with good news of their spiritual prosperity. In chapter 4, Paul comforts those who have lost loved ones in death. Jesus' resurrection is a guarantee that those sleeping in the grave will rise. In chapter 5, Paul describes future events that will lead to the destruction of God's enemies during Jehovah's day. He calls those who live by God's standards sons of light, in contrast with those who reject God's standards. He advises the congregation to stay spiritually awake, to make sure of all things, to pray constantly, and to encourage one another. As you read the first inspired letter to the Thessalonians, note how our perseverance in the face of opposition can encourage others, how the resurrection hope comforts and strengthens those who have lost loved ones in death, and how Jesus Christ, the King of God's kingdom, will destroy all of God's enemies. An introduction to 2 Thessalonians. The Apostle Paul was inspired to write this weighty letter in Corinth about 51 CE, shortly after he wrote his first letter to the Thessalonians. In his first letter, Paul encouraged the brothers to live quietly, to mind their own business, and to work hard to care for their physical needs. This counsel was still appropriate. Evidently, some were still meddling in the affairs of others and were reluctant to work to provide for their material needs. Also, the congregation may have received letters or messages that appeared to be from the Apostle Paul or other responsible brothers, saying that the day of Jehovah is here. The second letter to the Thessalonians has 3 chapters. In chapter 1, Paul commends the brothers for their faith and endurance, and he explains that those suffering tribulation will get relief when the glorified Christ comes in kingdom power to destroy God's enemies. In chapter 2, Paul's letter explains that certain things must happen before Jehovah's day arrives. Those things include the development of a great apostasy and the revealing of the man of lawlessness, a composite group of apostate religious leaders. This symbolic man would exalt himself over the congregations. Did you know? Because a letter falsely attributed to Paul may have been circulating, he wrote, "Here is my greeting, Paul's, in my own hand, which is a sign in every letter. This is the way I write." In chapter 3, Paul counsels the congregation to mark and stop socializing with any members who are still walking disorderly, perhaps because of their being unwilling to work. Yet the congregation should not consider these ones enemies, but should instead admonish them as brothers. The goal is to move them to repentance. As you read 2 Thessalonians, note how Satan can use proud, wicked men to corrupt the pure teachings of Christ. How we are wise to stop socializing with disorderly ones while admonishing them as brothers. And how we need to endure tribulation as we patiently await kingdom rule. An introduction to the book of 1 Timothy. The Apostle Paul's first letter to Timothy was written from Macedonia about 61 to 64 CE. Paul indicates that Timothy was in Ephesus at the time. Paul wrote 1 Timothy to set out organizational procedures in the congregation and to warn against false teachings and the love of money. 1 Timothy has 6 chapters. In chapter 1, Paul encourages Timothy to remain in Ephesus so that he may correct those who have deviated from Christ's teachings. Paul also expresses gratitude for Christ's great mercy. Even though Paul had persecuted the Christian congregation, Jesus considered him faithful by assigning him to a ministry. In chapter 2, Paul mentions the need to pray for others, including government officials, so that God's people can lead a calm life and pursue their ministry in peace. He explains that it is God's will that all sorts of people should be saved and come to an accurate knowledge of truth. In chapter 3, Paul outlines the spiritual qualifications for those reaching out to serve as overseers or ministerial servants. Did you know? The Greek verb translated reaching out means stretching to grasp something. The apostle thus shows that brothers who want to serve others in the congregation should exert themselves. Paul writes in chapter 4 that a time will come when some will fall away from the faith and try to mislead others. These apostates will speak lies and even forbid marriage. He encourages Timothy to be a fine example in speaking, in conduct, and in love. Timothy should continue applying himself to public reading and to teaching. In chapter 5, Paul counsels Timothy to treat older men as fathers, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters. He explains to Timothy that, if necessary, the congregations are to provide material aid to elderly widows who are truly in need and have a reputation for fine works. In chapter 6, the apostle states that those who teach things contrary to Christ's teachings are puffed up with pride. Paul also mentions that those who are determined to be rich fall into temptation and a snare and many harmful desires. Their love of money will lead to their spiritual ruin and cause them many pains. Instead of being greedy, Christ's followers should be generous and ready to share, putting their trust in God so that they may get a firm hold on the real life. As you read 1 Timothy, note how Jehovah wants all sorts of people to be saved and come to an accurate knowledge of truth, how Christians can avoid the love of money, and how we can get a firm hold on the real life, which only God's kingdom can give us. An introduction to 2 Timothy. This letter was written by the Apostle Paul in Rome about 65 CE. Emperor Nero had begun persecuting Christians, and Paul was again a prisoner in Rome. During his first imprisonment, he was under house arrest. This time his situation was far more serious. He was not only in chains, but he was also facing imminent death. Paul wrote this warm letter to Timothy to encourage him to stir up like a fire the gift of God that he received, to do his utmost to remain approved by God, and to flee from the improper desires of youth. 2 Timothy has 4 chapters. Paul opens his letter with warm encouragement for Timothy, who may still be in Ephesus. Paul mentions that some brothers in Asia have turned away from him. But he commends Onesiphorus, who courageously searched for Paul to minister to him. In chapter 2, Paul tells Timothy to teach other faithful men the many things he learned from Paul. The apostle urges Timothy to reject foolish and ignorant debates, knowing that they produce fights. Did you know? Paul's second letter to Timothy is the last of 14 books that the apostle was inspired to write over a period of about 15 years. He wrote at least 5 of those books while he was in confinement in Rome, the book of Hebrews being written either shortly before or shortly after his release. In chapter 3, Paul foretells what people in general will be like during the last days of Satan's world. Paul then reminds Timothy that the Scriptures, which are inspired of God, are able to make him wise for salvation. Paul also says that all those desiring to live with godly devotion in association with Christ Jesus will be persecuted. In chapter 4, Paul solemnly charges Timothy to preach the word urgently, because the time is coming when some will reject the truth, preferring to have their ears tickled with false stories. Paul then indicates that his death is near, so he asks Timothy to come to him quickly and to bring Mark along. As you read Paul's second letter to Timothy, note how Paul, despite facing imminent death, was primarily concerned about others, especially his beloved Timothy. How all those desiring to live with godly devotion will be persecuted, and how, like Paul and Timothy, we should fully accomplish our ministry as we keep our focus on God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Titus. The Apostle Paul's inspired letter to Titus was written about 61 to 64 CE. Paul may have written it in Macedonia sometime after his first imprisonment in Rome. Evidently, after his release, Paul served with Titus in Crete. After the apostle left, Titus remained. Titus had a difficult assignment in Crete. As a whole, the people there had a reputation for dishonesty, laziness, and gluttony. Those bad traits had influenced some in the congregation. So in his letter, Paul asked Titus to correct problems in the congregations in Crete and to appoint qualified men to serve as elders. The letter to Titus has 3 chapters. Chapter 1 sets out the spiritual qualifications for congregation elders. Paul then tells Titus to reprove with severity those who try to mislead their brothers. The deceivers include rebellious men, profitless talkers, and those who insist on adherence to circumcision. In chapter 2, Paul sets out many of the fine qualities that should be displayed by Christian men and women, including slaves. Paul encourages Titus by telling him to speak and act with full authority, adding, "Do not let anyone look down on you." Did you know? As shown by Titus' record as a Christian overseer, he could be entrusted with delicate and difficult assignments. He was courageous, firm, loving, and evidently a good organizer. Paul was confident that Titus would do a fine job in Crete. In chapter 3, Paul tells Titus to remind the Christians in Crete to obey the secular authorities, to be reasonable, not quarrelsome, and to display mildness toward all. Finally, Paul instructs Titus to avoid foolish arguments and fights over the law of Moses, and to reject anyone who persists in promoting a sect. As you read the letter to Titus, note how Christian overseers should courageously address problems in the congregation, how God's Spirit can draw people from all backgrounds and help them to develop a Christ-like personality, and how the bad traits that characterize Satan's world should be rejected by all subjects of God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Philemon. Paul wrote this letter primarily to his friend and spiritual brother Philemon, who lived in the city of Colossae in Asia Minor. Written in Rome about 60 or 61 CE, the letter concerns Philemon's runaway slave Onesimus. Onesimus somehow became associated with Paul in Rome and soon became a Christian. The letter to Philemon has just 25 verses. Paul opens with greetings to Philemon and to the congregation that meets in his house, including Apphia and Archippus. Paul tells Philemon that Onesimus, once considered a useless slave, is now a valuable spiritual brother, so much so that Paul would like Onesimus to stay for some time in Rome. But Paul does not overstep his authority by insisting that Onesimus stay without his master's permission. So Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon, who lives more than 1,400 kilometers away. On the basis of Christian love and personal friendship, Paul appeals to Philemon to receive Onesimus not as a runaway slave, but as a beloved brother. Paul even writes the entire letter in his own hand, which is unusual for him. Did you know? The letter to Philemon was Paul's only inspired letter addressed primarily to a private person about a private matter. The letter could be considered a reintroduction for Onesimus, a slave who is now also a brother. Paul expresses confidence that Philemon will do even more than what is asked. As you read the letter to Philemon, note how we can express confidence in our brothers. How Paul showed genuine humility by not overstepping his authority, and how he highlighted kindness and forgiveness, qualities that must be displayed by all who want to inherit God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Hebrews. Paul wrote this letter in about 61 CE, shortly before or after his release from house arrest in Rome. The information in the letter indicates that it was intended for Hebrew Christians living in Judea. Many had been Christians for years, yet spiritually speaking, some of these had gone back to needing milk, not solid food. This put their faith at risk, because it was under attack by the Jewish religious leaders and their supporters. The opposers may have argued that Christians had no visible realities to aid them in their worship. The Jews, however, had a magnificent temple, a priesthood, animal sacrifices, the law of Moses, and a history dating back to Abraham. Paul wrote to the Hebrew Christians to strengthen their faith in the far superior heavenly realities centered on Christ. Those realities place Christian worship high above that of fleshly Israel. Paul's letter may have also been helpful to Hebrew Christians who were still holding on to the Mosaic Law. The letter to the Hebrews has 13 chapters. Chapters 1 through 3 set the theme for Hebrews by describing Jesus' elevated position. He is superior both to the angels and to Moses. In chapters 4 through 10, we see Jesus as heavenly high priest, far above the sinful Jewish high priests serving at the temple. Unlike them, Jesus is perfect and without sin. The Jewish high priests had to offer sacrifices daily for the sins of the people, and they offered animal sacrifices, which had limited value. Christ entered into heaven itself to present to God the value of his perfect human life as a ransom once and for all time. Jesus' ransom also provides the basis for a new and better covenant compared with the one mediated by Moses. Did you know? At Hebrews chapter 9, verse 9, we read, "This tent is an illustration." Paul was here referring to the earthly tent or tabernacle that Moses set up. Worship centered on that tent and its animal sacrifices could not provide complete forgiveness of sins. The far greater tent, not made with hands, which is the arrangement for worshiping Jehovah on the basis of Christ's ransom sacrifice, provides all we need to have a personal and everlasting relationship with God. In chapter 10, we read that Christ's followers should meet together regularly to encourage one another, and all the more so as the end draws near. Chapter 11 focuses on faith, giving many examples of pre-Christian men and women who by faith were made powerful in word and deed. In chapter 12, we read that these courageous men and women make up a great cloud of witnesses. The apostle then points to the greatest witness of all, Jesus Christ, who is the chief agent and perfecter of our faith. Christ-like faith must, of course, be reflected in holy conduct. So Paul's final exhortations in chapter 13 include the words, "Let your brotherly love continue. Let marriage be honorable among all, and be obedient to those who are taking the lead among you." As you read the book of Hebrews, note how Paul beautifully shows the superior nature of Christian worship, how we can continue to perfect our faith as we await the end of Satan's world, and how Jesus, our heavenly high priest and the King of God's kingdom, is used by God to eliminate sin and death forever. An introduction to the letter of James. There is strong evidence that the James who wrote this inspired letter was Jesus' half-brother. James wrote the letter before 62 CE. He was living in Jerusalem at the time. The letter stresses the need to display faith and endurance amid trials, to avoid sins that lead to divine disapproval, and to prove our faith by our works. Like Jesus, James used many simple yet powerful illustrations drawn from common things: waves of the sea, flowers and trees, a man looking at himself in a mirror, and material riches that perish. The letter of James has 5 chapters. Chapter 1 reminds us to keep asking God for wisdom, doing so in faith, and that the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven by the wind and blown about. Chapter 2 contains strong counsel for those favoring the wealthy over the poor, thus creating class distinctions and violating the royal law of neighborly love. Did you know? James often alludes to the Sermon on the Mount. For example, he says that we can have joy when persecuted. We must do the will of God, not simply hear it. And if we want God to forgive us, we must forgive others. In chapter 3, James uses a variety of comparisons to illustrate our need to control our tongue. Especially is this true of teachers of God's Word. James compares the tongue to such things as the bridle of a horse, the rudder of a ship, a fire, and a spring of water. Chapter 4 explains that wicked conduct has its roots in fleshly desires. James also states, "Whoever wants to be a friend of the world is making himself an enemy of God." On the other hand, when we oppose the devil and draw close to God, he will draw close to us. Chapter 5 tells us that the rich and powerful who oppress others will have to answer to Jehovah. James also highlights the importance of patience. Just as a farmer patiently waits for rain, we must patiently wait for God to fulfill His promises in connection with Christ. In the meantime, anyone who becomes spiritually sick should seek help from the congregation elders. The elders' loving use of God's Word and their prayers of faith can help a sick one to become well. As you read the letter of James, note how we should never blame Jehovah for our trials, how we should take great care to control our tongue, and how we should be patient as we await God's kingdom. An introduction to 1 Peter. The Apostle Peter identifies himself as the writer of his 2 inspired letters, 1 and 2 Peter. Peter wrote his first letter from Babylon about 62 to 64 CE. Peter used Silvanus, also known as Silas, as his secretary. Silvanus was likely the Silas who was earlier associated with the Apostle Paul. Peter addressed his first letter to anointed Christians in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Christians in those lands were experiencing many trials. 1 Peter has 5 chapters. In chapter 1, Peter reminds his anointed brothers of their new birth to a living hope based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. By remaining faithful, they will gain the reward of the unfading inheritance reserved for them in heaven. So they need to brace up their minds for spiritual activity and guard against fleshly desires. In chapter 2, the apostle calls Jesus' anointed followers a holy nation and a royal priesthood that shares things with others. In chapter 3, we read that wives should be in loving subjection to their husbands, just as Sarah was to Abraham. Husbands, in turn, should show honor to their wives. Did you know? In his first letter, Peter quotes from at least 6 Bible books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Psalms, Proverbs, and Isaiah. By quoting God's Word, Peter imitated Jesus and set a fine example for us. In chapter 4, the apostle emphasizes the need to live for God's will in imitation of Christ, even if this means suffering fiery trials. He also says that we should be vigilant with a view to prayers. In chapter 5, Peter appeals to his fellow elders to be selfless and humble shepherds of God's flock. He then encourages all to throw all their anxieties on God because He cares for them. As you read 1 Peter, note how we should brace up our minds for activity, how husbands and wives should treat each other, and how we should be willing to endure trials as we wait for God's kingdom to come. An introduction to 2 Peter. The Apostle Peter identifies himself as the writer of his 2 inspired letters, 1 and 2 Peter. Peter wrote his second letter about 64 CE, shortly after he wrote his first letter. At the time, he may still have been in Babylon or its vicinity. Peter's second letter encourages anointed Christians to make their heavenly calling sure, to guard against false teachers, and to pay attention to the prophetic word. 2 Peter contains 3 chapters. Chapter 1 discusses Christ's transfiguration, which gave Peter, James, and John a preview of Christ's glory and kingdom power. The transfiguration made the prophetic word more sure, so Christ's followers should pay attention to it as to a lamp shining in a dark place. In chapter 2, Peter warns us that false teachers would arise and bring in destructive sects. Those deceivers, who began to appear in the first century, would face divine judgment as did the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. Did you know? When Peter wrote his second letter, he knew that his death was near. But instead of being overly concerned about himself, he continued to obey Jesus' loving command, "Feed my little sheep." Chapter 3 points forward to Christ's presence and kingdom power. Concerning that time, Peter foretold that there would be ridiculers who would deliberately ignore that Jehovah had destroyed a wicked world once before in Noah's day. Peter then points to God's promise of a figurative new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness will dwell. In the meantime, God's people should stick to the holy writings and engage in deeds of godly devotion. As you read 2 Peter, note how Christ's transfiguration can strengthen our faith in Bible prophecy, how we need to be on guard against false teachers, and how we must patiently await the new heavens, God's kingdom government, which will rule over a new earthly society of God-fearing humans. An introduction to 1 John. 1 John is the longest of the Apostle John's 3 inspired letters. John was likely in or near Ephesus when he wrote his letters in about 98 CE. He also wrote his gospel account at about the same time. John did not address his first letter to any individual, but wrote it as a general letter to all Christians. His purpose was to strengthen the faith of fellow Christians in the truths that God had revealed to the Christian congregation. The letter addresses 3 main themes: the Antichrist, sin, and love. 1 John contains 5 chapters. In chapter 1, John tells us that God is light and that Christians must walk in the light. To walk in the light, we need to recognize that we are sinners and need forgiveness based on Christ's propitiatory sacrifice. Chapter 2 warns us about antichrists. Among other things, they claim that Jesus was not the Christ and that the Son of God had not come in the flesh. Did you know? More than 3 decades earlier, it was foretold that false teachers would bring in destructive sects and try to draw away the disciples after themselves. John's writings show that this apostasy was well underway. In chapter 3, John contrasts the children of God with the children of the devil. The children of God love one another. The children of the devil, like Cain, hate their brother. The theme of love continues in chapter 4. Here, John reminds us that we cannot rightly profess to love God if we do not love our fellow Christians. In the final chapter we read, "This is what the love of God means, that we observe His commandments." Also, John assures us that God hears all our prayerful requests when these harmonize with His will. As you read 1 John, note how we must reject apostates, how we can guard against the practice of sin, and how we should cultivate love for our fellow subjects of God's kingdom. An introduction to 2 John. John wrote his second letter along with his other 2 letters about 98 CE. At the time, he was likely in or near Ephesus, and he may have been up to 100 years of age. John introduces his letter with the words, "The older man to the chosen lady and to her children." Some think that the chosen lady may have been a Christian congregation or a spiritual sister named Kyria, which is Greek for lady. Many points in John's second letter summarize thoughts from his first letter. For example, John again mentions the need for Christ's followers to love one another. He also states, "This is what love means, that we go on walking according to God's commandments." The apostle then warns that many deceivers have gone out into the world. These antichrists claim that the Christ did not come in the flesh. Did you know? At 2 John 10 and 11, John adds to the instruction in his first letter concerning anyone who pushes ahead of Christ's teaching. John states, "Do not receive him into your homes or say a greeting to him." John's second letter glows with his love for his anointed brothers. He wants them to obtain a full reward, which includes the privilege of ruling with Christ in his kingdom. As you read 2 John, note how the elderly apostle expressed love for his brothers, how he desired that they go on walking according to God's commandments, and how those who stand firm against apostasy will have the privilege of inheriting God's kingdom. An introduction to 3 John. John wrote his third letter in or near Ephesus about 98 CE. John addressed his third letter to a beloved Gaius, a common Roman name at the time. 3 John has 14 verses. Gaius had a fine reputation for enduring in the truth and for welcoming brothers who were strangers to him. and the Apostle John commends him for his hospitable spirit. Diotrephes' attitude contrasts sharply with that of Gaius. Diotrephes is disrespectful of apostolic authority and wants the first place among the brothers. Diotrephes refuses to welcome visiting brothers. He even tries to hinder and expel from the congregation those who show hospitality. However, Demetrius, a Christian and dear friend of John, is spoken of favorably. Demetrius may have been the one who delivered John's third letter. Did you know? At 3 John 6, Gaius is advised to send the traveling brothers on their way in a manner worthy of God. This would mean carefully supplying the brothers with what they need for their trip. Gaius evidently did this. At the end of his second and third letters, John explains that his letters are short because he hopes to see his brothers soon and speak with them face to face. As you read 3 John, note how it stresses the importance of Christian hospitality. See how it contrasts the attitude of proud Diotrephes with that of beloved Gaius. And observe how the depth of John's love is expressed for his fellow kingdom heirs. An introduction to the book of Jude. The Jude or Judas who wrote this inspired letter was evidently the same Judas named as a half-brother of Jesus Christ. Jude wrote his letter about 65 CE, likely from his Jewish homeland. At the time, a threatening situation had developed. Immoral, animalistic men had begun to slip into the congregation. So Jude stressed the need for Christians to put up a hard fight for the faith. The letter of Jude has 25 verses. In verse 5, Jude reminds us that Jehovah, after delivering his people from Egypt, destroyed the Israelites who showed a gross lack of faith. Likewise, verse 7 says that Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them are a warning example by undergoing the judicial punishment of everlasting fire. Using powerful metaphors, verses 12 and 13 describe the wicked intruders who enter into the Christian congregation as rocks hidden below water, as waterless clouds carried here and there by the wind, as fruitless trees that have been uprooted, and as wild waves of the sea that cast up the foam. Did you know? Jude's letter has information not found elsewhere in the Bible. Jude alone mentions the Archangel Michael's dispute with the devil over Moses' body. And only Jude mentions Enoch's prophecy that God, using myriads of angels, would execute judgment against the wicked. Jude concludes his letter by urging his brothers to keep themselves in God's love, to continue showing mercy to some who have doubts, and to save them by snatching them out of the fire. As you read Jude's letter, note his many references to examples of God's judgments. Meditate on his vivid illustrations, and observe how concerned he was about the purity and spirituality of those who hope to inherit God's kingdom. An introduction to the book of Revelation. Revelation was written by the Apostle John about 96 CE while he was in exile on the island of Patmos. The book of Revelation is closely linked to the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Genesis tells us how paradise was lost. Revelation tells us how paradise will be regained. Revelation can be viewed as being divided into 16 visions, covering 22 chapters. In chapters 1 to 3, John is told to write messages to 7 congregations, which are in Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. In chapters 4 and 5, John sees a vision of Jehovah on his throne. God hands a scroll sealed with 7 seals to the Lamb, who is the glorified Christ. In chapter 6, Jesus breaks open 6 of the seals. As he breaks open the first 4 seals, 4 symbolic horsemen ride forth. The rides of the last 3 result in war, famine, and death. In chapter 7, John observes 4 angels holding back the winds of destruction until all spiritual Israelites are sealed. The apostle also sees an innumerable, multinational crowd that has come out of the Great Tribulation. Did you know? At Genesis 3:15, God foretold that the offspring of a symbolic woman would crush the head of the serpent that induced Adam and Eve to rebel against God. Revelation exposes that original serpent as Satan the devil, who used a snake to incite the rebellion in Eden. The symbolic woman's offspring proved to be primarily the Messianic King Jesus Christ. Others were foretold to rule with him in heaven. Revelation says that these co-rulers would number 144,000. In chapters 8 and 9, the Lamb opens the 7th seal. John sees 7 angels with 7 trumpets. The trumpet blasts announce expressions of God's judgment on mankind. In chapters 10 and 11, a strong angel gives John a little scroll, which he is commanded to eat. John is then told to measure the temple sanctuary, after which he observes the experiences of God's 2 witnesses. Then the 7th angel blows his trumpet, and loud voices announce, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ." In chapter 12, John observes the birth of a son who is quickly taken away to God and to his throne, and the hurling of Satan and his angels to the earth. Then, in chapter 13, John sees fearsome beasts that dominate mankind. Chapter 14 shows the Lamb standing on Mount Zion with the 144,000. In chapters 15 and 16, 7 angels pour out God's anger on the earth by means of 7 golden bowls. Here we learn that God's great war against the nations will be fought at a symbolic place called Armageddon. Chapters 17 and 18 describe a drunken prostitute called Babylon the Great, who is riding a scarlet-colored wild beast. However, the beast, with its 10 horns, turns on the prostitute and devastates her. In chapter 19, John sees Jesus and his heavenly armies annihilate the wicked. The final 3 visions contained in chapters 20 to 22 describe the abyssing of Satan, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, the earthly resurrection, and the everlasting destruction of both human and spirit rebels. John also sees the glorious New Jerusalem and a river of water of life flowing out from the throne of God and of the Lamb. The banks of the river are lined with trees of life. As you read the book of Revelation, note how the complete fulfillment of God's promise at Genesis 3:15 is described in prophetic visions. See how God, by means of Christ, will remove all wickedness. And see how Jehovah's will is going to be done forever on earth as it is in heaven, thanks to God's kingdom.